Chapter 18. So, where exactly are we? After taking control of the conversation, Sophie began to ask for the information he wanted. He realized that he had changed a little. In the past, he could only speak so confidently in the game and easily grasp the rhythm of the conversation. Perhaps it was because he thought of this place as the world of the Amber Sword. His experience in the game was enough to make him treat these young people as if they were really children. He naturally exuded a confident temperament. This confidence unconsciously affected the others. Whether it was Freya or the others, they gradually felt a little different. Consciously or unconsciously, the focus of the conversation shifted to Sophie. Not far away, a few young people also raised their heads and looked over. "This is the Red Pine Forest, don't move." The ponytailed girl took a breath and tried to calm herself down. Sophie raised his head in surprise. As expected of the future Valkyrie, she learned to adjust her emotions so quickly. But in his opinion, she was still a little immature. Red Pine Forest? Wait, why are you here? Sophie was surprised again. He remembered this place was called Dwarf Valley in the game. It was the habitat of level 14 brown bears. But this place was south of Bucci, and the Bucci militia had no reason to appear in this direction. "We came to find you. We are looking for the Roman lady. She is a friend of Big Sis. And the Roman is a member of the third team." Everyone's voices were all at once. "You defeated Madara's advance force?" Sophie looked at Freya. This was the question he was most concerned about. "How is that possible?" The girl looked at him in confusion. Her expression was as if to say, how could he ask such a stupid question? "The guards covered the villagers and evacuated from the north. We were separated from everyone. And there were more and more monsters on the road, so we could only go south. Besides, I was worried about the Roman. So that's why you came here." Sophie felt her heart sink. The girl nodded her head naturally, her long ponytail bobbing up and down. Freya immediately felt a little strange. This young man wasn't Captain Martin, so why did she have a feeling that she was inferior in front of him? Sophie couldn't help but smack her forehead. She didn't know if she should say that these youngsters were naive or ignorant. They couldn't even protect themselves, yet they still wanted to save others. No, perhaps it should be said that he was kind-hearted. However, there was no need for unnecessary kindness on the battlefield. That would only harm oneself. Sophie fell silent. In fact, she could not help but vomit blood in her heart. He set fire to his grandfather's house to warn the village, but he didn't expect that history would follow its original path. No, it would repeat itself. "Lord Marcia, what kind of joke are you trying to pull? What kind of joke is this?" He sighed in his heart. What he could change was still too little. The inertia of history was not something that could be stopped with just a little bit of strength. Indeed, he had to become stronger, but before that, he had to survive. "Captain Martin, oh Captain Martin, it seems that even I can't save you. Why would the Romans' Black Rose Madara attack the border before the celebration of the eternal death in May? Such an obvious premeditated plan. If there was a counterattack, there must be a demon behind it." Sophie's hopes were all dashed, making him feel a little empty. He had fought so hard before, but in the end he found that history had not changed at all. This kind of blow was really depressing. But after all, it was only the strength of a normal person, and he had already done his best. "Brando." He was in a bad mood, but a surprised voice sounded in his ear. It was as happy as a lark. Sophie turned around and saw the merchant girl with a face of disbelief and surprise appear on the side of the forest. There was also a girl wearing a gray leather armor beside her. It must be this girl who went to inform her. The Roman came to his side like a gust of wind and stared at him cautiously, as if she was afraid that he would suddenly disappear. "I knew it, Brendel, you'll be fine." She sighed in relief and said happily, "That's right, Brando. Freya didn't let me go back to Bucci." Then the merchant girl hurriedly explained, as if she was afraid that he would be angry. Sophie then noticed that there were still 2 glistening tear stains on her face, and couldn't help but feel his heart soften. "It's okay, I'm fine now," he replied softly. "Really? Really?" Sophie nodded. "Roman, don't touch him, Mr. Brando is seriously injured." Freya couldn't help but frown. Did these two know how serious the injury was? Didn't they almost die? "It's okay." Although she said that, Roman stuck out her tongue and stood back. Sophie smiled. The merchant girl had such a temper. The young man looked at the 2 beautiful girls standing side by side, and couldn't help but feel that it was pleasing to the eye. He suddenly realized that it wasn't that there hadn't been any change, but the change was in another way. From the moment he came to this world, the world had already changed. If he didn't cross over, perhaps the merchant girl and Brando would have already met with misfortune. The bandits of Madara didn't have the heart to show mercy to the fairer sex. He looked at the others and the young people who were with Freya. In that war, how many of them were able to survive? Sophie remembered clearly that in that war, less than 10% of the militia and guards at the border survived. But now that he was here, perhaps history should have changed. He didn't know more, but at least the people around him should have been saved. These young people were the seeds of the kingdom's future. Sophie would never allow history to repeat itself. Alright, back to the main topic. Do you know how serious the situation is now? Then the young man exhaled, trying to make himself look less uncomfortable. To be honest, what he needed the most now was rest, but the current situation obviously didn't allow it. He looked at the others. Freya and the young militia were stunned. Only Roman winked playfully. The ponytailed girl asked, puzzled. Sophie coughed twice weakly and asked, I mean, what are you going to do next? If I'm not wrong, Madara's undead must have controlled the path, right? The surroundings quieted down. How did you know? Freya was slightly stunned and looked at him in surprise. Of course I know, not only do I know, I've experienced it myself. Sophie answered in his heart. But the shocked gazes around him still made him feel a little proud. It was good to be a prophet. But this little pride couldn't hide the worry in his heart. Madara's attack in April was swift and comprehensive. He had to build a more comprehensive plan to protect himself. And these young people. The enemy Butchie was facing was the flank of Madara's army, and the commander of that army was the famous Black Lord, Insursta. Although he was still a young man in his early 20s, it was from this war that this future general gradually showed his talent. But what did he have? At this moment in history he was just a nameless person. But Sophie understood that the only advantage he had now was his foresight. Indeed, this advantage could save his life in the following series of encounters, but he had to grasp the opportunity well. He only had two chances. One was to pass through the relatively safe Valley of Sharp Stones. He remembered clearly that it would only be on the 17th day when Insursta's deputy Cyclops, Tarkus, would control this area. But the distance was too far, and he was worried that he wouldn't be able to break through before the enemy completed the encirclement. Unless there were horses, but where was he to find horses for 10 men? So there was only one way left, and that was to break through the River of Daggers before the two squadrons led by Ghoul Weezer and White Knight Ebden surrounded him. Until the end of April, there was only a skeleton squad led by a necromancer stationed there. He couldn't help but touch the cold ring on his index finger. As long as he had the ring of the Wind Empress, wouldn't it be easy to break through the defense line formed by 11 skeleton soldiers and a necromancer? But before that, he had to make everyone in this militia squad listen to his orders. This was also the reason why he had been so aggressive from the start. Sophie looked at everyone again. This is a logical conjecture. As long as you have a bit of military knowledge, you will come to this conclusion. Sealing off the main road is to cut off communication and open up a path for your army. The next step is to use Butchie as the center to eliminate the remnants of Erwin's forces. He tried to make it sound as serious as possible based on his own experience. Then he paused for a moment and said with a heavy tone, "That's us." Silence, only the sound of the others' breathing could be heard. "So, what do you plan to do now?" Sophie asked weakly. Everyone looked at each other in dismay. There were more than 10 skeleton soldiers guarding the main road to Butchie. They couldn't just kill their way out, right? Although they had a youthful confidence that these enemies were nothing, but when it came to a life-and-death battle, they were still a little anxious. Freya had a worried expression. She didn't think so much when she made the decision. Although they were militia, in the end they were just a group of inexperienced youths. Although the ponytailed girl didn't say anything, her helplessness was written all over her face. Everyone's gaze had already landed on Sophie. Sophie's experience made him seem more stable than everyone here. This kind of impression was often imperceptible, and in times of crisis, he made people feel more reliable. "Brando?" Roman also asked. Sophie turned his head, and used a faint smile to signal her to be at ease. "We have to prepare for the worst." Then he turned his head to look at these people, intending to dispel their naivety. This wasn't the first time he did this. In the guild, the newbies who went to the battlefield for the first time always had an optimistic attitude, and once they suffered a blow, they would fall into a state of helplessness, so they would quickly crumble in front of an experienced team. In fact, the gap between players wasn't as big as imagined. The key was the mentality. And these old players were responsible for giving the newbies a heads up beforehand. Prepare for the worst? Sophie was about to speak, but suddenly there was a sparse sound from the forest. Everyone looked in that direction at the same time, and only Freya frowned slightly. She asked in the direction of the shrub, Jonah-san? It's me, Captain Freya. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief. But Sophie quietly waved his hand at the ponytailed girl, indicating the latter to be more vigilant. Freya saw his gesture and was slightly startled, but she immediately reacted. Erwin's militia training didn't allow them to leave their posts at will. And Sophie absolutely trusted the military training of Erwin's militia. Although these young people were naive, it didn't mean that they would forget the basic rules of daily training. There was no room for any negligence on the battlefield. What happened, Johnson? Freya asked as she put her hand on the hilt of her sword. I'm sorry, big sister, I was caught. Oh, Shernan parted to both sides with a swooshing sound and two people walked out from behind. The first one was a pale young man with his hands raised high with a sad face. And a lich followed closely behind, pointing at the back of the young man's head with its fingertips, while looking at the others with the flickering green flames in its eye sockets. Hee, I caught a group of little mice. Everyone was stunned. Johnson. How could you? Then there was a sound of disbelief. Note: unyielding, the first awakened ability is called the bloodline ability. It's not something every character has, or rather, the protagonist doesn't realize it. There are two main abilities of unyielding. First, stubbornness, it ignores all physical attacks during the duration, unless the person is beheaded or the heart is damaged. Also, willpower is increased to 10 ounces. This will cause the creature to be able to stay awake for 5 minutes after being fatally injured, even if it stops breathing. Second, self-healing, it strengthens the body's self-recovery ability, but this ability only works after the injury is stable. The bloodline ability will gradually strengthen as the character gets stronger, thus showing more characteristics. P.S. Looks like the dream of the third update will be shattered again. Also, I noticed that many brothers don't read the notifications because the effect of the noon update isn't good, so the normal update will be at 12 a.m. and 6 p.m. Chapter 19. Johnson. How could you? The young militiamen glared at their companions. The young man who was controlled by the lich's hand was pale and trembling. Shame and fear made him lower his head. But he didn't want to die, right? Freya felt that her heart was about to stop. She subconsciously pulled out her sword. But the lich immediately dispelled her thoughts. The green light in its eye sockets suddenly flourished, and one of the young man's arms immediately burst like a balloon. Blood splattered everywhere and the young man screamed miserably. His whole body fell to the ground and curled into a ball. Ah, big sister, I beg you to save me. Johnson rolled on the ground like a bloody man, wailing in pain. This frightening scene made several people turn around and vomit immediately. The ponytailed girl's face also turned pale. She swayed and almost fell down. Human girl, you better not act rashly. The lich warned her with a sharp voice. Its cold eyes swept across everyone present. But it immediately realized that the people present were just militiamen, not worth mentioning. Insects. The green light in the lich's eye sockets dimmed, and it was somewhat disappointed. It was ordered to hunt down the whereabouts of the human scout that had escaped earlier, and not to get tangled up with these insects. Freya's mind was blank, but she resisted the waves of dizziness and tried to think of a way to get out of this situation. She still remembered that she was the leader of this group, so she couldn't show her weak side. As for the girl beside Roman, she had already fainted. Fortunately, Romain held her. Sophie felt Roman's hand tightly grabbing her sleeve. This was a kind of reliance and trust. Previously, he also held the ponytailed girl from behind to prevent her from falling, but the latter's strength was beyond his expectations. But no matter what, he knew that she needed some comfort at this time. Otherwise she might collapse first. As a girl who lived in a peaceful era, it was difficult for her to accept such a cruel scene. Fortunately, Erwin was a war-torn country and most of the young people here had this kind of awareness. Freya. Sophie said weakly. The young girl was slightly startled and immediately woke up. She took a deep breath and calmed down with Sophie's help. Sophie could not help but nod in admiration when she saw that her fingers had become much gentler on the sword hilt. This kind of performance could be considered outstanding. Ordinary people rarely could calm down at the edge of life and death. He didn't know why he didn't seem nervous at all. It was as if his mind had become as calm as water after his transmigration and the test of life and death. But no matter what, at least it was a good thing. He continued to ask in an almost inaudible voice, "Do you still remember what I said before about preparing for the worst?" Freya was stunned for a moment and nodded slightly. "Do you still have the strength to fight?" It was an almost undetectable response. Only then did Sophie feel relieved. He rubbed the cold wind empress ring with his thumb. The response told him that the recharge was only half complete. 3 hours was way too slow compared to the 10-minute charge in the game. But fortunately half of the energy was enough. Even though it couldn't create a complete wind bullet, it was enough to create a strong wind. Anyway, he had already prepared for the worst. There was no possibility of it getting worse. At the same time, the Lich finally confirmed that there were no other ambushes. It didn't even look at the wailing wretch at its feet and raised its skeletal arm. Soldiers, kill them all. The shrill and dry voice rang out, and 4 skeletal soldiers with sharp swords and black chainmail appeared from the forest. They appeared from the thin fog, and their bodies creaked as they approached Freya's group step by step. Perhaps Freya's group had thought of fighting back against these cold monsters earlier, but not now. The young people were full of confidence before, but now they were frightened by the cold-bloodedness of the enemy. Their remaining courage was gradually defeated by the aura of death, and they were powerless to resist. They could only retreat step by step until they reached a dead end. Perhaps it was because of their biological instinct to protect themselves that they hurriedly pulled out the swords at their waist. But looking at how timid they were, no one could be sure how much fighting power they had left. Only the sound of inhaling could be heard in the forest. Looking at these pale-faced youths, the Lich couldn't help but sneer from its leaky chin. The green light in its eye sockets flashed as if it was enjoying the pleasure brought by fear. Indeed, human fear was their greatest enemy. They were weak, short-lived, and easily manipulated by useless emotions. In contrast, the undead naturally overcame all these flaws. Each of them could be the best soldier, especially the low-level undead. They didn't even need to think, they only needed to obey. Compared to the well-trained militia of the human race, who acted like helpless children on the battlefield, such weak creatures shouldn't exist in this world. It couldn't help but feel a sense of disgust from the bottom of its heart. Yes, Madara will win. But at this time, the Lich heard an extra voice. I'll leave it to you. It was the voice of a young man, calm, steady, and full of confidence. The Lich felt its soulfire jump slightly, which was an ominous sign. It immediately turned its head vigilantly. Reflected in its empty vision was a shiny ring. The ring was worn on the index finger of the seriously injured militia. It had never paid attention to that guy before. What was there to pay attention to a half-dead human? Pretending to be seriously injured could deceive others, but it certainly couldn't deceive the undead. These cold-blooded monsters that crawled out of their graves could look directly at the soulfire of a living creature. Sophie's weak and dim soulfire was definitely not fake. She was a seriously injured soldier. It seemed that it was true. But the real threat came from the ring on her hand. It was a magic ring. The green flames in the Lich's eyes dimmed little by little, and it could almost smell a deadly aura gathering in the air. It recognized this smell. One of its masters taught it black magic and let it come in contact with some counterfeits. And from the aura that escaped from it, it could tell that it was at least a magic ring that reached 20 energy rank. How could an official wizard's item appear in the hands of an ordinary person? The Lich couldn't help but show a look of horror and greed. Undead soldier, give me that thing. It raised its bone staff and screamed. Oz! But Sophie raised her right hand and spat out the word with all her might. It was more like she was squeezing out the remaining air from her lungs. When the young man fell back, he couldn't help but sweat profusely. The space expanded and then suddenly contracted. When the contraction once again exploded back to its original state, the turbulent airflow let out a shrill sound that was enough to pierce people's eardrums. The wind was like a straight arrow that pierced towards the Lich and its skeleton soldiers. Even though they raised their withered arms to try and protect themselves, the turbulence passed through their empty ribs and formed an air vortex that pulled them to one side step by step. There was no damage, but the restraining effect was obvious enough. Freya! Sophie shouted. The young girl responded and pulled out her sword. A crisp metallic sound was heard, and her long ponytail danced in the wind. But what made Sophie surprised was that this inexperienced militia captain did not act rashly. She immediately turned around and reprimanded the others. Mackie Irene. What are you waiting for, Butchie's militia? Third squad, follow me. Inspiring courage was sometimes like a signal. In a life-and-death situation, a sentence, a hint could make people explode with endless power. But there was a condition, and that was to be calm. One person's calmness could affect more people, just like now. Under Freya's reminder, the young militia was slightly startled, but they finally reacted. This was their best chance and their only chance to survive. The sudden gale caused the skeleton soldiers and the Lich to retreat, and they had no time to care about anything else. This discovery made the young men regain their courage. In the clanging sound of swords being unsheathed, The tactical qualities that they had trained on a daily basis seemed to have returned to their bodies at this moment. Maki, cover me. Despicable monsters, now it's your turn. Get rid of that black magician first. That's the Lich. Petit Finus, come behind me. They began to try to counterattack. But Sophie looked at the chaotic scene with some worry. He was afraid that these guys would be impulsive and ruin the situation, so he calmly reminded them from behind, remember to stay calm, everyone. Only when you calm down can you fight. In the Amber Sword he had seen many rookies who were exactly like these young men. Hot-bloodedness was a good thing, but they could not let it go to their heads. He had no choice but to recite the militia's battle regulations. This was something that everyone present had memorized before, but there were not many who could remember these dry and precious experiences in battle. It had to be said that Brando was an anomaly. Sophie had all the memories of the young man's last battle. As a new recruit, his performance could not have been better. Even as a veteran warrior, he had to admit that Brando was indeed a young man with exceptional talent in swordsmanship. The only pity was that he encountered the wrong battle at the wrong time. And on the other side, under Sophie's reminder, the young men calmed down. But this was not enough. Sophie knew that these guys still needed to gain a little advantage to strengthen their confidence. Otherwise, the morale that was built up in such a short period of time would easily collapse. The wind became weaker. The skeleton soldiers shook their chainmail and prepared to counterattack. They tried to regain their balance, but Sophie's voice had already instructed the Butchie militia to change their tactics. Listen up, these low-level Madara soldiers lack intelligence and move slowly. Turning around is their biggest weakness. Try to move left in the direction where they are holding their swords. There is a blind spot there you can attack safely. Maki, you and Irene have to attack from the left and right. Do you know how to cover them? Yes, attract the skeleton's attention. That's it. Sophie was half lying on a rock, staring at the situation on the battlefield while pointing out what the enemy should do next. There was a special magic in his words that made people unable to help but believe him. This was the power that people called confidence. It was steady, calm, and made people subconsciously rely on it when they were at a loss of what to do. And the Butchie militia soon got a taste of the benefits. First, under his reminder, I cut off the tibia of a skeleton soldier at the cost of a sword in his thigh. Then his partner, Little Phoenix, rushed up and pierced the skull of the skeleton soldier with a sword. The moment the sword pierced through the skull, the cold monster fell apart with a crash. The soul fire in its eye sockets flickered and quickly dimmed. A golden light flew out from the broken bones and entered Sophie's chest not far away. Sophie was stunned. Different from the last time, this time he clearly felt that something was wrong. Experience points. He suddenly realized this. But before he had the time to verify this, he heard the young militia shouting excitedly after defeating the enemy. Oh my God, I did it! I could not believe it. He pressed on his bleeding wound and shouted, Brando, how did you know this? Sophie smiled slightly. These experiences were summed up by him and his companions in the game. Even the most insignificant of them was filled with profound lessons because all of them were precious knowledge that had been tempered through thousands of battles and deaths. Brando also learned some similar knowledge in the militia training, but in Sophie's eyes, it was too superficial, too superficial. If that knowledge could increase his combat power by 10% when he faced the skeleton soldiers, then his own should increase by 50% or even more. From the year 375 to the Second Era, Sophie's battle experience with Madara had allowed her to know the enemy's lowest-ranked skeleton soldiers, and the highest-ranked liches, bone dragons, and even vampire lords like the back of her hand. In terms of understanding of the Dark Kingdom, there were probably not many people who could compare to Erwin. After all, before the First War of the Black Rose, the relationship between Madara and the Light World was not as tense as it was later. Friction and conflicts were not as frequent. Of course, these experiences were one of the things that Sophie was most proud of in this world. Relying on his familiarity with this world, he was confident that he could continue to walk, step by step, and return to his previous heights. But now he had to finish the work at hand. He did not know if the gust of wind caused by before had attracted other people's attention. For safety's sake, he had to finish the battle quickly. Thinking of this, his gaze fell on the Lich. This was a troublesome enemy. P.S. Some friends don't quite understand the conditions for this book to be on the list. I will explain it to everyone here. The list for this book is the weekly potential new book list. The conditions for the new book list are: the second or more published works after becoming a Chidian author. The total word count is less than 200,000 words. The book has been in the Chidian library for 30 days, and the book has been updated once every 3 days. The formula for calculating the potential value of new book list and new book list is the week's clicks *5 plus the week's recommendations *10 plus the total collection 2. The clicks will only be counted as clicks by members. It must be clicks by members who have logged in. It will only be counted once every 6 hours. Today this book's ranking rose by 2 places to the 22nd place. I hope to advance a little more tomorrow. Finally, I will continue to make a wish to be in the top 12. Chapter 20. Lesser liches were good at 2 spells, Veil of Darkness and Decay. These 2 spells were both black magic with the element of evil. In the game, dark magic was brought to the land by the Myurnas. The Myurnas were servants of the Dark Dragon. In the chaotic era before the beginning of the First Era, they lived on the frozen plateau north of Cruz. The Myurnas were good at using necromancy and dark witchcraft. Later on, these 2 spells, as well as all offensive spells other than elemental, nature, and holy magic, were collectively known as dark magic. After the Holy War, the Flame King Gretel drove these dark creatures to the cold east. It was said that no one had seen them since then. However, the Myurnas definitely existed. In the Codex of Darkness, the Dark Lords who were exiled to Madara learned their dark witchcraft from these demons. However, Veil of Darkness was not really called dark magic because it was a support-type concealment spell. This spell happened to be able to cover the tracks of a small group of skeleton soldiers. Of course, it did not mean that they would completely disappear. One could imagine a camouflage spell that blended into a dark background. Yes, it did not cover sounds, smells, or anything other than vision, and it was limited to a certain distance. However, in the dark, this spell became the best cover for Madara's undead army. This was also the main reason why Madara's undead army often chose to move at night. As for Decay, Freya and the others had already seen this terrifying dark magic from Jonathan. This was a vicious attack spell and also the main attack method of liches. It relied on negative energy to corrode the enemy. The more negative the enemy's emotions were, the weaker their willpower was, and the more damage they would receive from the spell. Until death. This spell was similar to the majority of black magic. It amplified negative energy in order to materialize destructive power. Possessing mysterious dark magic and commanding skeleton soldiers who did not have the ability to think, they were stronger and had a cunning nature. It seemed that liches were an enemy that was difficult to defeat. However, Sophie knew another secret. Liches did not have the ability to cast spells. Their true power came from the bone staff in their hands. It was a powerful magic item that belonged to every liches. Once it left their hands, it would turn back into an ordinary staff. Knowing this, it was easy to understand how the tactics around it should be carried out. As another skeleton soldier fell, under Sophie's reminder, Freya and Irene, the strongest swordswoman in the militia, surrounded the lich who was preparing a spell. Attack its hand. Black witchcraft isn't as mysterious as you think it is. Sophie pointed out the weakness of the undead monster. Do you see its hand gesture? Stop it from completing its spell and take its bone staff. The lich suddenly raised its head and looked at Sophie. A ball of phosphorescent green flames flickered with resentment. Sophie choked and felt her throat go dry. She knew that the zombie had its eyes on her. But she quickly calmed down. It was impossible for the zombie to bypass the militia and attack her. But being stared at by a lifeless, cold monster was not a comfortable thing. Sophie had to stop and wait for Freya and Irene's attacks to take effect. The lich smiled eerily and shook its bone staff. The darkness around it swayed like ripples and drowned it. When Irene's long sword pierced through the air, it only pierced through the air. The undead monster's original position was now empty. The young man was slightly stunned. Sophie's expression did not change. She was too familiar with the tricks of these guys. Irene, it's on your left. Irene did not react for a moment. But Freya, who caught up from behind, had already swung her sword. The sword drew a straight silver line in the dim environment. Just as it was about to reach the position that Sophie pointed out, the lich had already staggered back. Everyone saw the shadow that was retreating like flowing water. Human, who are you? You're not a militia. A sharp voice burst out from the shadow. The lich seemed to be flustered and exasperated. Indeed, it was impossible for a militia to know so much. Some of what Sophie said was only spread among the wizards in Madara. But Sophie did not answer, and Freya's second sword followed. The lich's eyes flashed with green light. It raised its bone staff and pushed the girl's sword away. The lich had 1.7 energy rank, and Freya's strength was probably not higher than Brando's. The ponytailed girl's attack was easily diverted to the side. She rushed forward a few steps before stopping. She immediately covered her left shoulder and frowned slightly. The arrow wound from before seemed to have split open again. "Big sister, let Mackie do it, your injury?" Irene saw this scene and could not help but shout as she blocked the Lich's attack. Mackie and Petit Finus caught up from behind. "Petit Finus, back off." But Freya held her sword horizontally in front of the Lich and ordered sternly. "But I'm also a militia." The Lich shouted indignantly. "Back off, do you hear me?" Petit Finus was so angry that his neck turned red, but even so, he did not dare to disobey Freya's order. Freya had always been the leader of this group of youths. The girl was kind and had her own principles, and everyone was very respectful towards such a leader. Sophie shook her head at the back. The battlefield was not a place to argue. But the ponytail girl's persistence made him feel good. Girls like her were rare in his world. "All four of you come at me together," he said from behind. "Mr. Brando, you." Freya took a deep breath and could not help but look back. The young man lying on the rock, the Roman, was still standing beside him. He looked at her with an innocent expression and even winked at her. This damn girl, she defected to the enemy so quickly. She could not help but feel annoyed. The Lich is a very difficult enemy to deal with. "The four of you can cover each other," Sophie answered seriously. "But Petit Finus? He's also a militia." Freya bit her lips and looked back. Mackie and Irene were retreating under the Lich's attacks. If the undead monster found a chance to cast spells, this group would lose even more members. That was not something she could afford to lose. Thinking of this, she could only nod. "All right. Hooray. Brando, you're amazing," Petit Finus shouted and immediately unsheathed his sword. But Freya grabbed his collar from behind and ordered sternly, "Follow me and don't go out of my range, do you understand?" "Oh." A disappointed voice. After Freya and Petit Finus joined the battle, the situation immediately changed. She and Irene were the best swordsmen in this batch of Butchie's militia, and surprisingly, Petit Finus was not inferior at all. In Sophie's words, this child had a strong desire to attack, and his sword was decisive and accurate. It was not like Erwin's military swordsmanship, which focused on both offense and defense, but more like Cruz's aggressive swordsmanship. But no matter how one looked at it, this was already an extremely high evaluation from a veteran warrior's point of view. Sophie thought that perhaps when Petit Finus grew to Brando's age, his swordsmanship would not be inferior at all. Of course, his intelligence would be slightly inferior because Brando seemed to be born for battle. He sometimes thought that if the young man in history did not die and grew up in the war, his achievements would not be any less than Freya's. But the world was unpredictable and there were no ifs in history. Of course, the most important thing in this battle was the young man's reminder. Sophie seemed to be able to see through the Lich's thoughts, and as long as it had the slightest intention, he would be able to point it out. What was it trying to do? Why was it doing this? Was it preparing a spell? When did it need to be disturbed? The Lich became more and more frightened as it fought. The undead spirit could not feel fear, but it would still be at a loss. In the end it screamed, "Who are you, a necromancer? Or a black knight?" This sentence was met with a merciless strike from Freya's sword, and the monster's claw that was gripping the bone staff was sent flying. The monster screamed in pain and the green flames in its eye sockets dimmed. Despicable human. The battle finally ended with Mackie's sword, and the Lich was already exhausted from dealing with it. After its hands and bone staff were shattered, it howled unwillingly, and looked on helplessly as the sharp blade cut into its skull. With a crack, the soul fire burst out from its body. This was the monster's counterattack before it died. But with Sophie's reminder, only Irene, who was a little slower to dodge, suffered a little burn on her right hand. On the other side, the others also killed the remaining two skeletons at the cost of one of them being injured. When the forest returned to its calm state, only the wind could be heard rustling through the top of the forest. Everyone could not help but stop and look at each other. Including Freya, everyone was in disbelief. They actually won, facing 4 skeleton soldiers and a terrifying Lich. Mackie's sword first fell to the ground with a clang, and then it was a chain reaction for the others. Everyone could not help but hug each other, shouting and screaming, and some even cried to vent their feelings. After surviving a disaster, it really made people feel a little absent-minded. Sophie, on the other hand, calmed down. He looked up and saw 3 golden lights flying from the darkness into his chest. And no one around seemed to notice this detail, even the Roman standing beside him was no exception. Romain let out a sigh of relief. Was he the only one who could see this? Sophie could not help but feel a little strange. He looked around and subconsciously opened his character attributes. Just like when he was still in the Amber Sword, Sophie was always the first to check the gains and losses after a battle. Lines of green numbers immediately appeared on his retina. Strength 1. 1 Dexterity 2. 0 Vitality 1. 0 Intelligence 1. 1 Will 1. 3 Wisdom 1. 0. Absolute Strength 3. 5 Elemental Attribute Unawakened. Brando Human Male Level 1 Strength System. Physical Melee Talent Unyielding XP 4 Commoner Level 1. Militia Level 2 6/10 HP Weak Near Death 10%. Bandaged recovers 1 HP per day. Profession Idle Skill 1 XP. Commoner Basic Knowledge Level 1. Geographical Knowledge Level 0. Local Knowledge Level 1. Militia Military Swordsmanship Level 1. Fighting Skills Level 1. Tactical Theory Level 0. Military Organization Level 0. The attributes that changed were Strength and Vitality, which meant that his physical fitness had improved from the militia training, leveling up. His absolute strength increased by 2.5 ounces, mainly from the Ring of the Wind Empress 1 dexterity increase, and the change in his physical fitness was secondary. In the end, he only obtained a total of 4 EXP from the 4 skeleton soldiers and the Lich. It was only half of the XP he deserved. Sophie thought for a moment and finally came to a conclusion. The party penalty. This was simply ridiculous. How could there be such a thing in the real world? But as a gaming nerd, he did not have any professional knowledge to explain all of this. After all, compared to this, transmigration itself was a more ridiculous thing. Wasn't it? At first, he wanted to know how the party penalty was calculated, but he soon realized that it was futile because it had nothing to do with the game. Lord Martha, thank goodness I'm a little thick-headed. He could not help but touch his forehead as he had a headache. But then Sophie looked at his militia level and hesitated for a moment. To be honest, he did not want to continue investing XP in this class. The militia was so useless that it did not need to be described with words, so much so that it was always called an NPC class. In his previous life, he never thought that there would be a day where he would waste XP on this class. And he even chose the talent, Unyielding. Martha above, there were too many talents that were suitable for a warrior, and Unyielding happened to be the worst one. This skill could allow him to survive a fatal physical attack, but he only had 5 minutes to make arrangements, unless he received a strong enough healing before then. But until now, he had not seen an item that was stronger than the bandage that could restore HP. After all, these things were everywhere in the game. But Sophie did not regret it too much. In any case, this skill saved his life. But the current situation was the same. The reality was that he could not find a way to switch to another class. And he urgently needed power, so the only way left was to walk the path of the militia to the end. Sophie could not help but feel a little depressed for a moment. Was he going to change from a veteran warrior to a veteran militia? Hey, aren't warriors enough cannon fodder? P.S. Thank you to the 3 friends Peep Through the Galaxy, 285260808, and Marshall Shunglong for their long comments. Also, thank you to 285260808 for providing the reader group. Let me advertise, Amber Sword, Golan, 127759266. Made a map, not sure if it looks good, come to the group if you want to see it clearly. CPW, 34H, 41A, LU, http://file2. Chidian. Com chapters 201011251784763427169847481750068067. Chapter 21. Sophie stared at his stats for a while, but in the end he didn't make a decision. It was better to take one step at a time. After all, it wasn't time yet. However, because he had leveled up once, he had to use the 10 skill points immediately. After all, in a dangerous environment, every bit of extra strength counted. Of course, it seemed like it was a good idea to use it to learn swordsmanship or to learn fighting skills. If it was an ordinary person here, they would definitely choose to do so. However, Sophie hesitated for a while and thought of something else. Thus, he let the data fade from his retina and raised his head to look at the others. He found that these young militiamen were still immersed in the excitement from before. He was slightly startled, and then his face showed a serious expression. This wasn't a good sign. He motioned for Roman to help him up a little, and then raised his voice and asked, "I say, do you think you're safe?" His voice wasn't loud, but it made everyone present stop. Suddenly, it became so quiet that a pin drop could be heard. Sophie's influence was still there, and these young militiamen hadn't forgotten who had led them to victory. Speaking of which, wasn't this young man's alarmist words now becoming reality? Only then did they suddenly realize that now was indeed not the time to celebrate. It was a strange feeling to be on someone's chopping block and still dance with joy. Thus, everyone stopped at the same time and looked at him. Sophie was very weak, but he had a temperament that could lead them to victory. Everyone thought so, even Freya sighed softly. This was supposed to be her responsibility, but she couldn't control her emotions like her teammates and forgot her responsibility as a captain. Thinking of this, the girl with a long ponytail couldn't help but show a look of self-blame. Bandage your wounds, clean up the battlefield, think about what you learned during training. You don't need me to remind you, right? Sophie also sighed. These hotheads were really more inexperienced than novices. Fortunately, their physical fitness was much better than ordinary NPCs. Of course, that was only compared to NPCs. Compared to players, they were nothing. Hero template was hero template. Thinking about the initial stats and growth? Forget it, it was better not to think about it. Sophie couldn't help rubbing her forehead. Under his reminder, the young militia of Bucci started to move. Indeed, the injured needed to be stopped and cleaned, and the swords and armors of the skeletons could be recovered. Especially the chainmail, it was much better than their leather armor. Others extinguished the bonfire under Sophie's instructions. Roland did not know whether to laugh or cry. Lighting a bonfire behind the enemy, he really did not know what these guys were thinking. Freya wanted to see if there was anything she could do to help. After all, Sophie was not familiar with them. However, the girl with a long ponytail soon discovered that there was no need for that. No matter how she looked at it, the young man named Brando was much more considerate than her. She couldn't help but fiddle with her long ponytail. She had some doubts in her heart. They were both militia, how could Braggs and Bucci be so different? Freya had never thought that the people in the city could be stronger than them, but now in front of Sophie she couldn't help but feel discouraged. How could it be like this? In comparison, the Roman lady did not have so many worries. She had already happily gone with the others to organize the spoils of war. It seemed like this future merchant girl was interested in this. Sophie noticed that the little rascal called Petit Finus ran to the unconscious Johnson. He raised his head and asked everyone, "What about Johnson?" This question startled everyone. For a moment, a strange silence spread among the people. Indeed, they were all from the same village and were familiar with each other. They could be said to be good friends. Johnson was the most cowardly among them, but they did not expect him to do such a thing. Although they were forced to do so, this betrayal still hurt them. It was like a crack in the pure world, and the distrust between people was born like this. Even Freya did not know how to deal with this lack of trust between people. She wanted to protect every one of her companions, but Johnson not only hurt others, but also deeply hurt himself. Even if the ponytailed girl wanted to speak up, she was not confident that she could convince the others. Once she spoke, the harmonious relationship between friends would no longer exist. Everyone had the same thought. After all, they were just simple young people. Weakness and uprightness existed at the same time. They hesitated and subconsciously looked at the only outsider present. Sophie. Our protagonist could not help but sigh. "Miss Freya?" He asked Freya. I don't know." "Then bandage him. We don't even know if it can stop the bleeding. He might die before sunrise." Sophie sighed. He was curious why he could be so calm. Wasn't it the first time he saw a dead person? Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. This was Sophie's order, and they only needed to carry it out. This was a form of escape, but sometimes people rely on escape. On the other side, Sophie waved at Freya, gesturing for her to come over. The ponytailed girl was slightly startled and looked at her strangely. "You know first aid, right, Miss Freya?" Sophie asked. "Just call me Freya." Freya nodded. "I learned a little from Captain Martin." "Captain Martin?" F***CK, so that old guy even teaches first aid. Sophie almost choked on her own saliva. In the game, the first NPC to teach first aid in the Grimoires region was Dr. Borg from Fortress Reden. That guy would give you a quest to collect 50 bundles of flax. It was so infuriating that many people skipped over to Braggs, where they only needed to pay 10 silver coins to the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Although the market price of 50 bundles of flax was not much different from 10 silver coins, the process was much more troublesome. This was a secret that had yet to be discovered. Sophie was excited, but before he could rejoice, he suddenly remembered that he could not go back. What was there to think about? He was immediately disappointed and could not help but become dispirited. "Can you tell me more?" Freya took a deep breath and could not help but grit her teeth. She looked at him. Damn it, didn't this guy say that her skills were bad? Fortunately, the girl was not a vengeful person. She thought for a moment and asked, "What do you want to know? Techniques and key points?" The ponytailed girl did not answer immediately, but came to his side to check on the girl who had fainted. Previously, Roman had excitedly run off to sort out the spoils of war, leaving her here. Fortunately, she was just agitated. She looked back at the young man who did not look too good and hesitated. "Let me take a look at your injuries." "No need, I know my own injuries." "You? Okay, what did you learn?" Sophie avoided the topic. "It's mainly bandaging and bleeding stopping techniques as well as cleaning wounds." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. It was like a telepathic connection. It was not a voice nor was it a text, but he clearly felt a message. "Freya wants to teach you battlefield first aid. It requires 8 EXP to upgrade to level 0. Do you want to learn?" He let out a long sigh. This is it. It was exactly the same as in the game. Of course he had to learn. He did not expect it to be battlefield first aid. This was really a pleasant surprise. Battlefield first aid mainly focused on stopping bleeding and preventing wound infection. It ignored environmental factors and increased the success rate by quite a lot, which was what Sophie urgently needed. He remembered that in the game only the priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire knew battlefield first aid, and players from the Theology faction were the easiest to learn this skill. As for other players, they had to farm reputation. But it was a big discovery that Martin knew this. As he thought about it, he agreed to the request in his heart. But immediately another message came in. "I didn't find a suitable profession for battlefield first aid. Which profession would you like to place it under?" This was not important, but Sophie still placed it under the profession of militia. Although battlefield first aid was a non-profession skill for both militia and civilians, which meant that it would require double the EXP to level up. Militia as a profession could level up, but civilians as a basic identity could not. It was important to know that the level of the skill could not exceed the profession itself. Freya carefully explained the main points of the bandaging technique, but the heroic girl quickly found that the young man lying on the ground was staring at her blankly, as if he did not respond to her words at all. She was stunned for a moment, and immediately felt a surge of anger rising from the bottom of her heart. This guy, is he looking for an excuse to take advantage of me? The girl clenched her fists, so angry that her long ponytail trembled. This bastard, how can you be like this? How can you face the Roman? That girl clearly has her heart set on you. Freya tried her best to control herself and waved her hand in front of Sophie's face, but there was no response. If it wasn't for the fact that he was injured, she would have kicked him. But at that moment, Sophie's eyes moved and clarity returned to his eyes. He sorted out his skills and felt a little satisfied. With first aid, at least he had a guarantee of endurance in the upcoming battle. A party's recovery ability was an important criterion for a party's survival. Experienced players in the game would not overlook this, and Sophie was no exception. This was the reason why he gave up on sword fighting and chose first aid. But when he raised his head, he saw Freya looking at him with dissatisfaction. What's wrong? He could not help but be stunned. Are you listening? The girl gritted her teeth and asked. Of course I've already learned it, Sophie answered matter-of-factly. You, Freya almost choked on her words. I haven't even finished and you already know it? She looked at him with a gaze of serious distrust. Of course. Freya choked. Just as she was about to retort, someone shouted, Boss, we can't stop Jonathan's bleeding. Come and take a look. The ponytailed girl turned around instinctively and saw Sophie behind her saying, just in time. Do you want me to give it a try? You. Freya's face was filled with serious suspicion. Help me over. Don't try to be brave. Then I'll ask Miss Roman to help you? Dream on. I won't let her get close to you again, you shameless bastard. Freya gritted her teeth, but she still went over to help Sophie up. What shameless? Sophie was stunned. Why did she suddenly have another title? You know it yourself. Ha. P.S. It's a new week, so the results are very important to this book. Everyone who has votes, please vote here. Thank you. Also, please continue to look for good comments. I'll compile the good ones and put them in related posts. Chapter 22. The light in the temporary hall flickered between bright and dark. The candlelight had been deliberately reduced, and the dim light left deep marks on the texture of the wood. The remote corner was quiet, and the air was filled with an eerie atmosphere. Everyone present wasn't used to the bright firelight, But as long as the pale-faced middle-aged man with an eye patch didn't open his mouth, the rest of the people didn't dare to act rashly. If Sophie was here, she might be able to recognize this person, because his appearance had not changed much after more than 10 years. This was the deputy of the Black Lord in Sursta, the vampire baron, One-Eyed Tarkus. He was a member of the Manline family, the 14th generation vampire, and also the younger generation. But compared to his experience in the Madara army, he was far more experienced than the young in Sursta. But it did not matter, this was just the beginning of their cooperation. Tarkus looked at the skeleton soldiers taking out stacks of information from the library. He paused for a moment, turned his head, and asked the lich beside him, "Tell me, what did Rothko leave you here to report?" "Honorable General Tarkus, my master found a scout in the manor." The lich lowered his head and replied with a dry voice. "So?" He glanced at it, and his gaze returned to the tactical map spread out. "He escaped." There were a few disdainful sneers around. The vampire general raised his head, and the soft voices immediately subsided. He paused for a moment and then said, "I know Rothko did a good job. But I hope it will be better, so that he will not be distracted by these trivial matters. I want to see him arrive at the Belder Forest before noon." The lich nodded respectfully and left. But as soon as it left, there was a discordant voice in the meeting room. This time the one who spoke was a tall skeleton. Its whole body was covered in an old brass armor. Dark yellow flames flickered in its eye sockets, revealing a kind of anger. "Lord Tarkus, maybe the humans have discovered our intentions, that scout." It opened its mouth but suddenly no sound came out from its leaky jaw. This was because it saw Tarkus staring at it with its remaining eye. This gaze made it subconsciously shut up. A burst of low laughter came from the surroundings, and the sarcasm in it made the flames in its eyes flicker in annoyance. "Cabius. Here." The tall skeleton immediately replied with its chest puffed out. "You go and take down this place." Tarkus pointed at a village on the map. "Before sunrise," he pointed at the roof again, "I want to see the results." "Yes, Lord Tarkus." "Wuxia Ebden." "Here." They answered in unison. "All of you attack Verbin and seal off the River of Daggers." "Yes, Lord Tarkus." "Jigs." "Here. I'll give you 2 squads. Search and clear this area." "Yes." Tarkus raised his head and coldly swept his gaze over everyone. "You are all nobles of the darkness. We want to see you execute my every order gracefully and swiftly, meticulously. Fortress Reden is our next target." He took the lead and stood up. He placed his pale hand on his left shoulder and chanted, "Madara will be victorious." All the undead stood up and replied in a low voice, "Madara will be victorious." Tarkus lowered his head and looked at the map again. He first saw the red pine forest in the south of Buchi, then moved up to Green Village, Belder Forest, and then Fortress Reden. "Human scouts?" He smiled coldly. At the same time, the full moon shone on top of the pine forest. There were no wolves howling in the mountains of Yusong, but there was a wind in the black pine forest. The cold wind was like smoke that passed through the branches of the trees. It was so cold that people could not help but feel a chill down their spine. The youths of Buchi had never spent the night outside. The fog in the forest made them a little suspicious, as if every shadow was a terrifying monster. But a voice calmed them down. "Press down on this spot." "Yes, that's right." "Water? Give me a bandage." "Press it down." It was finally done. Sophie wiped the sweat off his forehead and let out a long sigh. He saw a light green +2 appear on the youth's body. Only then did he feel relieved. After his first aid skill reached beginner, level 0, the healing effect of the bandage naturally increased. There was no difference between this and the game, but every part that matched Sophie's memories made him feel more at ease. How to clean the wound, prevent infection, stop bleeding, bandage, and what details to pay attention to. He guided Maki and Niberto to complete all of this. Of course, he did not have the stamina to do it himself. His body was weak but only slightly better than the unconscious Jonas. When Niberto completed the last step under his instructions, Sophie looked up and realized that everyone was staring at her with their mouths agape. Professional. This was the only comment they had in their hearts. Petit Finus even turned his head and said to Freya in a serious tone, "Big sister, compared to your skills, it seems that your skills are inferior." As for Freya, she stood on the side of the crowd with a calm face. Sure enough, he was just looking for an excuse to get close to her. Shameless. She could not help but conclude in her heart. She looked at the Roman with some concern, only to see him counting the spoils on the ground with a smug look on his face. This damn girl. However, only Sophie himself knew that all his knowledge came from the skill, battlefield first aid. It was only when he recalled the skill in the list that all the knowledge appeared in his mind. And in the young man's memory, most of the beginner first aid knowledge came from the first 3 sections of the book, Jerson's Holy Cross, which mainly talked about bandaging skills. Sophie happened to know Jerson in the game, the current High Priest of Brags. The content of the book was as if he had seen it himself, as if he had studied it hundreds of times. The feeling of being at ease was like learning first aid skills with a plug-in. Unfortunately, there was a price to pay for using a plug-in. On the other hand, Sophie quickly understood that in fact, there were a total of 10 members in Butchie's 3rd militia team. Including Freya, there was Mackie, Irene, Ike and Petit Finus, who he was familiar with. Then there was Niberto and Vlad, who did not like to talk much. The 2 brothers' families were mountain people who migrated from the Bora region. They inherited the quiet nature of the locals and loved to do more than talk. Then there was Jonas, but the latter was unconscious and the chances of waking up were not high. Then there was the dreamy merchant girl and the girl who was with her. Sophie later found out that the girl was the town's baker's daughter, but she was shy and introverted, unlike the other 2 ladies who were generous. The girl was called Bertha. She had a gentle personality, but at least she was a good girl with a kind heart. These were all the people Sophie had to deal with. They seemed to be very outstanding young people, but Sophie knew that they were a bunch of newbies who did not understand what they were going to face. Thus, he thought for a while and asked, "Do you have any plans?" In the next moment, the smiles on their faces disappeared, and it was replaced by silence. "Let's go to Fortress Reden." After a while, Irene suggested. "That's right, Captain Martin, and the rest will definitely go there." Ike agreed. As expected, Sophie shook his head. He raised his head to look at the youths, and saw that they were silent, uneasy, and at a loss for what to do tomorrow. Even though Freya seemed to be in a better state, her grip on her sword was so tight that her knuckles turned white, betraying her true feelings. Only Roman answered naturally, "I'll go with Brando." Sophie was both annoyed and amused at the same time. However, the merchant girl's straightforwardness left a good impression. The young man paused and said, "All right, I agree with you on one point. The most important thing for us now is to leave this place." "That means there's something you don't agree with, right?" Freya asked. Sophie nodded. "Does anyone have a map?" Everyone looked at each other. Who would have such a thing? Although they were militia, most of the time they were under the command of the local guards. To put it bluntly, they were just a reserve team. Sophie also realized his slip of the tongue. In Erewhon, without the permission of the Holy Cathedral, he would be treated as a spy if he carried a map. He always thought of himself as a traveler, and forgot that he was already a member of this world. And here there were no more players. The guards seemed to have one. Mackie stammered from the back of the crowd. Sophie shook his head and thought to himself, "Isn't that nonsense?" He sighed and turned to the merchant girl. "Roman, give me a sword." "All right, Brando." Sophie took the sword and drew 2 lines on the soft ground. "This is the Wuxia River and this is the Yusong River." He used the tip of the sword to point a few times between the 2 rivers. "This is Butchie, this is Green Village and this is Wei Bin." He only used a few simple strokes to draw a rough outline, but it opened the eyes of the young people once again. After all, in this era, there were not many people who understood the world as well as he did. "Isn't that the 3 towns?" Bertha couldn't help but cover her mouth. "That's amazing, so this is what we look like here." Ike looked at Sophie with admiration. "So Butchie is here?" "Brando, how did you know?" Everyone asked at once. After all, they were young people and they couldn't suppress their curiosity. Sophie shook his head. What a joke, he didn't even recognize the 3 towns novice village, then he might as well find a piece of tofu and kill himself. Of course, he couldn't answer like that, so he purposely asked, "Haven't you learned about tactical maps?" "Tactical maps? What's that?" Everyone was at a loss. Mother Marcia above, could it be that even the militia of Brugloss had to learn this? Everyone couldn't help but admire him blindly. But our main character laughed in his heart. Even the lower-ranking officers in the regular army wouldn't know about it, so it would be strange if the militia learned it. Of course, he wouldn't expose himself in front of everyone, but he pointed at the intersection of the 2 rivers. "This is Fortress Reden." "Ah, this is Fortress Reden?" the Roman asked curiously. "What's wrong?" Sophie could clearly hear the stifled laughter around him, and he couldn't help but raise his head to ask. "It's like this, Brother Brando. When the Roman was young, she was very envious of the merchants in Fortress Reden, and wanted to be a merchant every day. Once she ran out and said that she wanted to do a big business in Fortress Reden, But in the end, Petit Finus not only betrayed the country but also kept them guessing. The people around couldn't help but laugh. In the end? Sophie asked. Haha, she got lost in the forest halfway and it was Uncle Seal who found her. Petit Finus laughed. No such thing. Roman's eyebrows were raised. Sophie looked at the future merchant lady, and couldn't help but think that she didn't learn her lesson. Alright, let's get back to the topic. Why do you want to go to Fortress Reden? He calmed himself down and continued to ask. There's an army there. Captain Maiden and the others will definitely go there. My uncle too. Everyone started to talk at once, but they all had the same idea. They all had their own family, and although they were separated they might go to Fortress Reden, so why not go there? Sophie couldn't refute this answer, but it was normal. Who would leave their family behind? But he also knew that those who escaped from Buchi would most likely be caught by Madara's army. And if they went to Fortress Reden now, they would only be walking into a trap. Sophie was very clear that they had to advance parallel to Death God Cabias and avoid it by entering Belder Forest. They had to cross the River of Daggers before Ebden and Weezer could surround them. From there, they would enter the Hunting Deer Forest, and pass by Insursta's main force to Anzek, where they would inform the local garrison about the Gusta tribe's plan. This was the only way for them to survive, and Erwin wouldn't lose as badly as he did in history. But how should he say it? Forget it, let's just follow the old rules and take one step at a time. He rubbed his heavy forehead and changed his words. Alright, we can go to Fortress Reden first and decide what to do next based on the situation. He raised his head and saw Freya's worried expression. The girl obviously didn't believe him. Mr. Brando? It's nothing, just a guess. Maybe the situation will change. He smiled at the girl. But even though he said that, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Reality was cruel and it wasn't up to him to make a choice. Of course, if there was a chance he would definitely try again. Taku, you're so naive. He couldn't help but laugh at himself. P.S. My grades never went up, sigh. Chapter 23. Both sides spent the night in a state of urgency. Tarkus was waiting for the attack plan to unfold bit by bit, while Brando was worried that he would not be able to grasp the time. Madara's army and Buchi's 11 youths were walking side by side in the silent darkness, their fates alienated yet closely linked. But the sun would eventually rise day after day. The first ray of light seemed to have just passed through the hair, but the morning passed in a flash. Half of the day was peaceful, and they did not even encounter the most common brown bear in this area. But after summer, the brown bear in the wild also became a gentle animal. It was noon. Hearing the sound of the bushes in front of him, Brando could not help but squint his eyes. The sunlight shone through the new green leaves, showing a beautiful fragmented gold between the gaps. He followed the sound and looked up from the simple stretcher. Like a mirror, a shining reflection reflected in his eyes. It was a lake. Like an emerald gem embedded in the mountains and forests, the ripples created a pool of sparkling light. Look, it's a lake. Petit Finus shouted in surprise. Freya immediately rewarded him with a knock on the head, making the youth cry out in pain. It was not a good time to travel, and now it was better for everyone to be cautious, because no one knew if they would encounter Madara's army nearby. Although the night was peaceful, Brando said that it was because this area had no strategic value. As for what the strategic value was, the girl did not know. The young man from Bragg's always seemed to know more than everyone else. Although she was somewhat unwilling, she could only admit it. She did not know if every youth in the city was as good as him. Under the subtle influence, Freya's perception had completed a transition from one extreme to another. She could not help but be a little jealous. If she also came from Braggs's militia training camp, she would have learned better than that shameless guy. It was really unfair. But only God knew, there was no such thing as Braggs's militia training camp. Sophie, no, it should be Brando. His militia training was done in Draeger. Of course he would never expose this trick at this time. He needed to maintain some prestige so that these young people would believe that a team without a leader would not be able to get out of this predicament. Freya might be able to take up this position in the future, but not now. Thinking up to this point, Brando couldn't help but glance at the other party. The girl with the long ponytail was considering her surroundings. She hesitated for a moment before she relaxed her grip on her sword and let out a sigh. Let's rest here. Freya ordered after confirming that there was no danger. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief. We're going to die. I bet that when we reach Fortress Reden, I'll just lie down and sleep. We'll see when we get there. Irene, shut your mouth. At the edge of the forest, the sound of young people talking could be heard. Although they deliberately kept their voices low, their words were still filled with a sense of happiness. Everyone was too tired. The night wasn't too long, but it was torture for his tense nerves. Normal people would not be able to imagine the pressure of life and death. The group of people walked through the forest under the dim starlight. They were surrounded by darkness where they could not even see their own fingers. Only the nocturnal sounds of insects flapping their wings could be heard, and the screeching of owls could be heard from afar. In the darkness, the rustling sound seemed to pass through one shrub after another. Coincidentally, silence surrounded everyone, as if a silent ghost had seized everyone's heart. The gloomy and cold atmosphere could not help but make people's nerves tense. Behind the dense foliage was always an unknown. Have you ever heard of the mountain monsters described in bedtime stories? At sunrise, the cold dew slowly dissipated. The young people looked like they were fished out of the water. Their faces were pale and their wet hair stuck to their foreheads. Even Brando was not an exception. He used to sleep in his own bed, away from all the conflicts. He did not lie on a stretcher, listening to all the strange sounds around him. Especially in the unknown darkness, there would be grass that reached your waist brushing past your face. You did not know what kind of insects were crawling around your neck. It was creepy. Marcia above, when he thought about how he would probably have to live like this for more than a week, he was a little crazy. He now missed his past life very much. Even if it was a little useless, he still wanted to return to a stable life. Otakus were always full of confidence when making a promise, but the passion came and went quickly. But when he saw the tired and worried expression on Freya's face, his heart calmed down. Because he was trusted. He suddenly realized that he had to abandon the identity of Sophie and try to accept a new life. He could not help but touch his chest. The one who died was not Brando but Sophie. It was not that he accepted this world but this world accepted him. Brando's stretcher was placed by the lake. Not far away he could see the colorful pebbles. He first checked Jonathan's condition. The latter miraculously survived, but his physical condition was not good. How is he? Mackie could not help but ask. It's hard to say. Sophie, no, he should be called Brando now. He shook his head. Mackie was silent and stared at the lake in a daze. This lake was called Lake Che. They came here, which meant that they were close enough to the Green Village. But among all the people present, only Brando knew the correct direction. The young man looked in one direction. In that direction, there were a few faint traces of gray smoke in the sky. It seemed that Cabias had already attacked the village. Its fate was not far from Butchie's. Madara's army attacked quickly, just like he remembered in the game. In fact, Brando still remembered this lake. He raised his head and looked at the other side of the lake. In that direction, the trees were lush, and under the dark mountains he could no longer see the familiar figures of the past. He remembered that he had leveled up in this area for a long time with brown bears and foxes. Thinking of the days when he sold leather to make money in the game, Brando could not help but smile. He removed his hand from Jonathan's forehead and said to Mackie, "Do me a favor." "What is it?" "Help me take off the bandage." Brando wanted to change the bandage, but before that he wanted to let the Roman distribute the roll of sausages he took from his house. He wanted everyone to have a taste of the black sausages from the Grinoires region. He did not know whether to laugh or cry. These young people did not even think of preparing food before they escaped from Butchie. Even Freya, who looked so calm and steady, did not think of this possibility. That was why they only had one roll of sausages left. "Why don't you tell me what you saw on the day you left Butchie and learn more about the enemy?" "Och, Mackie, be gentler." His eyebrows twitched as he gasped in pain. Freya saw this scene and could not help but sigh. "Let me do it, move aside, Mackie." The young man was stunned, and the girl with the long ponytail had already walked in front of him. "Is it okay to distribute the food like this?" She lowered her head and carefully removed the bandage for Brando. She hesitated for a moment before asking in a small voice. "What problem?" "This guy, he knows what I'm talking about." Freya could not help but grit her teeth, but what made Brando laugh was that even so, this kind girl did not dare to do anything with her hands. "You know what I'm talking about, we can't go to Fortress Reden, right?" Freya's voice was even lower, almost inaudible. Brando could not help but look at this girl again. Of course he felt that her light brown ponytail suited her temperament very well. He thought for a moment and asked, "Your aunt and uncle should be in the group, right?" Freya lowered her head, and her hand that was removing the bandage stopped for a moment. "I'm sorry," Brando sighed. "If there's a chance I'll try my best. But I can't guarantee anything, I can't take on such a big responsibility." "Thank you." An almost undetectable answer. Big sister Freya, big brother Brando, what are you whispering about? Petit Finus's untimely voice sounded at this time. He was sitting under a beech tree, curiously looking at the two of them. If big sister Freya was someone he had always admired, then Brando was this young man's new idol. His words successfully attracted everyone's attention, and everyone's eyes turned to him at the same time. Freya's face suddenly turned red. Only then did she realize that she was too close to that guy. She quickly took a step back and explained, "No, nothing, we're just discussing." Unfortunately, this innocent girl did not understand that it was better if she did not explain, but her explanation made it seem like she was trying to cover something up. Especially her flushed face. When had the captain ever been so shy? Roman rubbed her sleepy eyes and sat up from the ground. She seemed to have just figured out what had happened. Even though Freya was afraid that she would misunderstand and kept trying to signal her with her eyes, she did not expect the merchant girl to smile nonchalantly as if she was thinking wrongly. "It's all right, Freya." "Roman, you..." The ponytailed girl did not say anything, and instead her face turned red. She glared at Roman, almost wanting to strangle this girl to death. Brando noticed that there was a worried look in the crowd. It was the young man named Niberto. He was slightly startled. Could it be that he was interested in Freya? But he could not lack courage. He could not help but shake his head. "That's enough," he interrupted. "I'm discussing the food distribution with your captain." When Brando opened his mouth, it was as if he had a natural prestige, making everyone stop and involuntarily turn their attention to him. "But Roman, what is the meaning of your sparkling eyes?" He thought to himself, "Are you looking at a pile of treasures?" The young man shook his head and continued, "With this amount of food, even if we save some, it's not enough for us to eat. Besides, we still need to maintain our strength to deal with the enemies we may encounter." But Freya had just said half a word when she saw Brando shake his head at her. "The Green Village is not far away. Why don't we go there to find food? The undead do not need food and shelter, and those things originally belonged to us humans, so we naturally have the right to take them back." He answered. "The Green Village? Was it not attacked by Madara?" Ike sat on the ground and asked. The wound on his leg was bandaged by Brando, and it was almost healed today. The healing effect provided by the bandage was a potential recovery value, which referred to the effect that would slowly occur during the next time the bandage was changed. In the game, it took 6 minutes for the bandage to take effect, but in this world the recovery period was extended to 1 day. Therefore, the wound would slowly heal over the course of a day until the next bandage change. "Of course there are enemies, but we will move in small groups so we may not necessarily clash with the enemy," Brando answered. He had already thought of this arrangement for the escape route, and now he had a card up his sleeve. "Small groups, does that mean we'll sneak in?" Petit Finus was immediately interested. "Yes, I'll pick a few people to go with me." Brando nodded, his eyes looking at everyone. "Ike and Vlad are injured, Mackie and Niberto stay and take care of them. Roman, you stay and take care of Bertha. As for the others, Irene and Freya, you two come with me." "No. No." Freya and Petit Finus objected together. "Irene and I can go, but Brando, you have to stay." The ponytailed girl took a deep breath. Did this guy know how serious his injury was? "I want to go too." The brat was the first to jump up. Brando looked at the two of them and sighed. "All right, I'll answer your questions one by one." As he spoke, he bit the bandage in his mouth, then wrapped it around his body a few times and tightened it. A light green +2 appeared on his body. He took a deep breath and felt his strength gradually returning to his body. Although he was still very weak, especially since the corrosive poison was still eating away at his life force, at least he could move on his own. He looked up and asked, "Miss Freya, why do you want me to stay? Injury? It's good that you know." The ponytailed girl turned her head away. Brando smiled slightly. "That might not be the case. P.S. Screaming at the top of my lungs for recommendations, I feel like my score has been deducted. I don't know if I'm seeing things." Chapter 24. Not going to Green Village? That's impossible. Brando knew something that would have a huge impact on his future plans. Therefore, whether it was to stock up on food or to verify his hypothesis, he had to go to the village that might have been occupied by Madara. Therefore, he thought for a moment and calmly asked, "If I don't go, do you know how to start?" Infiltrating and searching is not something that can be taken for granted. It requires careful planning and investigation beforehand. Infiltrating and searching were the strengths of those who had invested a lot of training in the shadows, such as the Nightingale and the Hunter. As a warrior, Brando didn't know much about them, but after all he had formed a team with them and gone on a mission. With this kind of memory he was much better than these militia. Freya shook her head. It was not that she didn't understand, but Brando's injuries were too serious. You can tell us what to do and leave the rest to us. Brando wasn't surprised by Freya's rejection. He knew that he had to choose the persuasion method that he was good at. For example, the wisdom of a veteran warrior, Roman. Yes. Give me your sword. He opened his hand to the side. Here, Brando. The Roman held the sword with both hands and confidently handed it to him. Thank you. Brando took the sword, took a deep breath, and tried to adjust his condition to the best. He was in a weakened state with less than 40% of his HP, and the decaying poison made him unable to use the other 20% of his strength. In other words, he could only use 0.6 ounces at most. It was about the same as a 14-year-old boy. There is not much time to prove that I have the ability to participate in this expedition. We might as well use an ancient and traditional method to decide. He pulled out the sword, the way warriors talk. Our protagonist looked around and found that everyone looked as if they had misheard him. Martha above, in this batch of Butchie militia, Freya deserved to be called the #1 swordswoman. Even Irene was defeated by her. Brother, do you really know how bad your condition is right now? The same question popped up in their minds. Brando, don't joke around. Freya said somewhat angrily. She was quite confident in her swordsmanship. If Brando could defeat her in this state, did he think that he was a veteran who had experienced the November War? Brando didn't say a word. He only made a pleased gesture with his sword. The ponytailed girl was so angry that she almost blacked out. She thought that there should be a limit to being reckless, but it seemed that the reality was not as she thought. She gritted her teeth and made up her mind to use reality to teach Brando a lesson. Freya straightened her sword and slashed vertically without thinking. Her basic skills were outstanding. Her sword was very steady and brought about a thin blade wind. Brando blocked with his sword, but the huge force from the sword almost dislocated his wrist. But he immediately flattened his sword and slashed down at the edge of Freya's sword. The young man's strength wasn't great, but it gave Freya a fright. Because she hadn't entered the attack range yet, the opponent's sword was almost touching her hand guard. Even though she was unwilling, the ponytailed girl could only return without any success. In fact, she wasn't at a disadvantage. Brando's move was very famous among the warriors' swordsmanship. It came from Cruz's battle formation swordsmanship. In the game it was called Brando's reverse cut. This was a high-level combat swordsmanship. Even though Brando could only rely on this body's original swordsmanship to display it, it was more than enough to deal with an amateur swordswoman like Freya. Brando remembered that he learned this move from a mercenary after traveling thousands of miles. The price was 2 barrels of Madara's bone wine. Now it seemed that the 2 barrels of bone wine were worth it. Freya retreated. In order to deal with Brando's following attack, she gripped her sword with both hands and clenched her teeth, pushing the opponent's sword to the side. Her reaction was fast but not smart enough. Because Brando had already retreated a step, when she reacted, the long sword in his hand was already pointed at her chest. Freya clenched her teeth and used the hilt of her sword to knock away Brando's sword. Then she chased after him with her sword. But to Brando this sword was already out of order. It was purely because he didn't want to admit defeat. He lightly knocked, and the opponent fell to the ground because she lost her balance. Dust flew everywhere. Looks like I've convinced you. Brando withdrew his sword and replied indifferently. Freya raised her head, her face full of disbelief. Not only her, the 9 people of Butchie's militia, other than the Roman who still took it for granted, were all dumbfounded. Was that still the militia swordsmanship? Compared to those veterans in the regular army, wasn't it? How could it be? It's not strange. I'm Braggs's #1 swordsmanship in the 33rd batch of militia. Brando casually replied, and then you, Petit Finus, let us solve your problem. Petit Finus looked terrified and quickly shook his head. I'd better not go, you guys go. This kid. Brando couldn't help but shake his head. After agreeing with the others on the time and place to meet up, Brando, Freya, and Irene quickly set off. Time was tight, forcing them to race against time. The green village was about east of Lake Che, so it wasn't too far away. Especially when the 3 of them went deeper into the forest, through the dense canopy, they could see a few gray pillars of smoke in the east. The sky was getting darker and darker, and it didn't look like a good sign. According to Brando's memories and suggestions, they approached the area that Madara might occupy from the north of the village, and the facts proved that his guess was correct. The undead army had just swept through the area, leaving behind a scorched land. Looking at the burning village below, Freya's last glimmer of hope was extinguished. It seemed that Madara's army was indeed in front of them, so it would be impossible for them to reach Fortress Reeden in time. She couldn't help but look at Brando, wondering what this young man was thinking. But Brando was hiding in the bushes, looking at the skeleton soldiers passing by and carefully counting the trees in front of him. He counted to the 12th tree and memorized the appearance of the tree. Green Village, south of the forest, the 12th beech tree. He remembered clearly that there was a key buried under the tree. In the game, it was an independent quest that led to a tomb in the village. He remembered who had discovered the quest. It was a priest, wasn't it? But it didn't matter because he knew that it was the tomb of a Templar knight. If everything went according to the game's development, there should be some good stuff inside. But his goal was the sword in the tomb, the Thorn of Light. It was a treasured sword infused with the power of light. At his current level, wielding it was equivalent to wielding a mini-undead slaughterer. Of course, he could only imagine how powerful the legendary divine weapon would be. After confirming this, Brando turned around and pointed outside the forest. "Do you see that?" "See what?" Irene and Freya were stunned. The number of skeletons patrolling, 2 times 4 times. Looks like there are 2 teams of Madara in the village. 22 to 24 skeleton soldiers and 2 necromancers, our protagonist replied in an experienced manner. "That's a lot." Irene was shocked. "Fortunately, that's not the main point. The main point is that they control the cemetery in the square. The necromancers will definitely use spirit summoning there. They will have an endless supply of reinforcements. That's what we have to be careful about." Brando continued. "This is blasphemy against the dead." Freya clenched her fists in anger. "Indeed, but they have the right to do so." He sighed, then pointed at the forest not far away and said, "Do you see that over there? That ranch? You can use the fences and the shadows of the bushes to sneak in. There should be a cellar under the barn. It shouldn't be hard to find and it shouldn't have been burned down. You can hide there and wait until it's dark before we come out." The girl nodded subconsciously, but suddenly realized something was wrong. "How do you know?" "I've been here for a while." Brando answered casually. He wasn't lying. It was just that he wasn't in this world. "And then what are we going to do?" Irene asked. "Wait for me there. I'll come to you at night." Those monsters should be focused on summoning the skeletons. They won't bother you for the time being. If you do attract attention, you have to pay attention to your breathing and heartbeat. The undead can see your life force. Brando reminded them bit by bit. "Wait, you're not with us?" Freya caught on to this detail. "I have my own things to do." She was about to say something when she saw the young man patting his sword. His meaning was, "Don't forget that I've already convinced you." But how could that be the same thing? Freya opened her mouth to refute, but Irene pulled her back and signaled her to be careful of the patrolling skeletons in Madara. "Do you trust me?" Brando asked softly. Freya shook her head, but hesitated and nodded. "That's good. Now is the time. Hurry up and go. Don't worry, I'll come back safe and sound." He answered seriously. Freya looked at him and wanted to say something but stopped herself. But in the end she was pulled away by Irene. Brando watched them pass through a colorful forest and hide in the bushes below. Then they followed a fence and passed through the long meadow. Finally they successfully sneaked into the ranch. He heaved a sigh of relief. Brando turned back and looked at the short forest below. A sense of nervousness suddenly shrouded his heart. This would be his first adventure alone in this world. Maybe it looked the same as before, but there was no failure here. There was only death. Speaking of which, he was more willing to work with Freya and the others. But how could he explain the key? He couldn't say that he buried it in the past. This kind of clumsy lie wouldn't even fool Irene, let alone the meticulous Freya. After weighing the pros and cons, he decided to work alone. "There's no difference, old man. Just treat it as cutting it down and training it again." He rubbed his forehead and couldn't help but encourage himself. "P.S. It's almost 12. Can I watch it today?" Chapter 25. When the 2 figures of Freya had completely disappeared, Brando calmed down. Unlike sneaking into the pasture from the other direction, where he could use the colorful forest as cover, from here to the undergrowth below, he had to be in the line of sight of a whole group of skeleton soldiers. Taking risks was necessary, but unnecessary risks were also unnecessary. He decided to wait for the sky to turn dark before starting his operation. Although the undead could see life energy directly, their search range was limited at night. But Brando was not idle, he was observing the patrolling pattern of the skeletons below. Soon he found a gap in their patrolling. Around the time when the two scattered squads crossed each other, he could get a gap of 10 seconds. He looked at the terrain. From here to the undergrowth below, there was a distance of 20 meters. He had 2OZ agility, but in the weakened state he could not use it at full strength. To complete a 40-meter round trip and dig out the key buried under the tree in 10 seconds, this seemed to be an impossible challenge. He decided to find another way. The sky quickly darkened. "It's time to move," he said to himself in his heart. His whole person blended into the dark environment, but in fact he was so nervous that his heart was pounding. This was a game with his life. What game's death penalty could be more exciting than this? He held his breath and stared below, silently counting 14. It was exactly the time it took for the two pairs of skeletons to cross each other. Then he first threw the sword in his hand in that direction. This was the first step. 20 meters away, the sword fell on the soft leaves and made a soft sound. Brando waited for a long time in fear. When the first patrol passed by for the second time, he confirmed that everything was normal and sighed in relief. Next was the main point of the plan. Brando counted for the second time. When the two squads of skeletons crossed each other for the third time, he took a deep breath and rushed out. At that time his mind was almost blank. He could not think, nor could he care about anything. There was only one goal, and that was speed up. 3 seconds. Brando arrived and let out a long sigh. He squatted down, dug up the fallen leaves, grabbed his sword and began to dig. But the efficiency was very slow, far beyond his expectations. He dug while counting in his heart. 1, 2, 3. 6 seconds. He gave himself an extra second, then threw away his sword and started running back. The scenery around him seemed to be moving as fast as lightning. He dived into the bushes and stopped, feeling as if his heart had stopped beating. The skeleton soldiers passed by him for the fourth time, but they did not discover his existence. Brando took a deep breath. He felt that this stimulation made his limbs go soft, but the accelerated secretion of adrenaline made him deeply excited. Then he shrank back and continued to wait for the second round. Brando was much calmer in his second attack, but this time he returned without any success. The third time he only dug for 2 seconds because he could clearly feel his stamina dropping. Then for the fourth time he finally came into contact with the cold, square-shaped object under the soil. Brando had never seen such a thing before, but at this moment his heartbeat couldn't help but accelerate. That was it. Brando had a certain feeling in his heart. For a moment he could not help but want to dig this thing out, but he knew that there was not enough time. He took a deep breath to calm himself down, put down his sword and ran back. The fifth time Brando had completely calmed down. He ran under the tree, picked up the sword and began to pry open the square stone slab. It immediately loosened, but at this moment Brando's ears twitched. Wait, the sound was not right. The skeleton soldiers below changed their patrol route. Impossible. Our hero felt a chill in his heart. He did not know if God was playing a malicious joke on him. Madara's skeleton soldiers lacked basic intelligence. They would not change their patrol route unless there was a lich's intention. But the lich would not change its original intention for no reason, unless there was an external invasion. Brando's past experience in the game became very clear at this moment. He could not help but look in the direction of the ranch. Could it be that Freya and Irene had been exposed? But looking down from the hillside, the direction was calm. The young man immediately dismissed this idea. The footsteps of the skeleton soldiers behind him were getting closer. The monster should have seen him. Brando felt his blood freeze. What should he do? There were 6 skeletons below and any one of them could kill him. Use the Ring of the Wind Empress? No, not to mention that the sound would attract trouble. With the size of the wind bullet, it was already good enough to hit 3 skeletons. What about the rest? Brando felt his scalp tingling more and more. He kept reminding himself to stay calm and think about what he usually did in the game. Yes, make use of the advantages. Every attribute point and skill in a player's hand could be used to survive in a desperate situation. As long as he used his imagination. He immediately thought of a possibility, but this crazy idea also scared him. This is not a game. Brando, can you afford to pay that price? He could not help but ask himself. But the skeleton soldiers were getting closer and closer. He had to make a choice. He took a deep breath and immediately stabbed his sword into his lower abdomen. The tearing pain came from his abdomen. The strong feeling was 10,000 times more intense than in the game. Brando groaned and almost knelt down. He felt like he was going crazy. Large beads of sweat appeared on his forehead, but at the same time the skeleton soldier's footsteps also stopped. Success, the unyielding skill was effective. It deceived those unintelligent skeletons. Brando did not dare to be negligent. He resisted the waves of dizziness and pulled out his sword. Although he had deliberately avoided the vital parts, blood still splashed out. The young man did not dare to look. He was almost breathing hard as he used his sword to pry out the square slate. Then he turned around and slid down the hillside. He had 5 minutes to save himself. His life was hanging by a thread. The unyielding skill ignited the soul fire to support him all the way to the village. But when Brando fumbled into the village, he was shocked. Between the ruins of the buildings, there were snow-white skeletons everywhere. Those new skeletons were the Lich's masterpiece. Under the influence of the summoning spirit, they crawled out of the graveyard or tore open flesh to crawl out. Under the gradually darkening sky, these white skeletons brought a huge sense of oppression. Fortunately, Brando was experienced and knowledgeable. Otherwise he would have been scared to death. He calmed down and counted the number of skeletons. There were more than 50 of them. This was not a small number. This meant that Madara's invasion strength was increasing with their pace. But the only thing that made him feel at ease was that Brando knew that these thin skeletons were not on the same level as their kind that had been refined by darkness. They were even slightly weaker than an ordinary adult man. Brando looked as he moved forward. His goal was the small temple in the village. It should be in the north, if his memory was not messed up. Among the many disadvantages brought by death, there was always one advantage. That was, the undead wandering on the street regarded him as one of their kind. Even if Brando bumped into these headless guys, the latter would at most adjust their balance and continue to move forward. This was a huge piece of good news. With this advantage, it only took him 3 minutes to find the Temple of Kaladas. But it seemed that the undead of Madara did not have much respect for the god of pottery in the game. They had already collapsed one of the walls of the temple. This provided a lot of convenience for Brando. He directly went along the wall and went in. It was pitch black inside. Brando remembered that the temple had been rebuilt, but after exploring it for a while, he found that the interior was not too different. He quickly found the path to the meditation room with his memory. To his surprise, there was a wandering skeleton in the meditation room. Brando jumped in fright when he saw it in the dark. Fortunately, his nerves were strong enough to withstand it. But he quickly calmed down and tried to take a deep breath to comfort himself that this was just a puppet without any intelligence. But his breathing was getting harder and harder, and his vision was starting to blur. He had about a minute left. Brando recalled that the entrance to the secret passage should be behind the podium. He groped there and found the square depression. At that moment he really felt like Martha was on top of him. He was almost trembling as he pressed the slate into the depression, afraid that God would play a malicious joke on him again. Fortunately, it did not. In the dark silence there was a soft click, then a second click, then a muffled rumbling sound came from the ground, and finally, with a crash, he felt a breeze behind him. Brando looked back and saw the tomb passage that led down. There was light inside, and the walls of the passage were inlaid with purple shimmering crystals. These things were not valuable, but the light was too dim, so they were not widely used. He shook his head and the dizziness almost knocked him out. There was no such thing in the game. The player would not feel any discomfort for the first 5 minutes of the unyielding skill in the Amber Sword. But when the time was up, even if you were as strong as a bull, you would still fall down immediately. Brando was almost relying on his own will to hold on, and the desire to live urged him to grit his teeth and move forward. As he walked, he recalled the history of the tomb. The Templar Knight who was buried here was a famous NPC called Gerald or something. He was born here and participated in Erwin's War of Independence. He lived a righteous life, and after his death he was buried in his hometown according to his wishes. It was said that this place used to be a forest, but later on, a shrine was built here. The people of the Holy Cathedral of Fire modified the tomb of the Templar Knight so that he could rest in peace in the kingdom of God. The sword that Brando was looking for was called the Thorn of Light, and it was also the weapon that the knight used when he was alive. The young man did not intend to disturb the peace of the dead, but presumably, the knight did not want the undead to wreak havoc in his hometown. The youth started to gasp for breath. He used all his strength to support himself against the wall of the tomb for 20 to 30 meters, and the end of his vision gradually became brighter. This kind of gentle white light that lasted for a long time must be the effect of a high-grade glimmer gem. I'm close to my goal. But before he had time to breathe a sigh of relief, a black shadow suddenly fell from the ceiling. 2 steel claws clasped his shoulders and lifted him up abruptly. Brando felt a huge force seeping into his limbs, as though there were 2 iron chains on his body, preventing him from moving. He immediately realized that this was an absolute difference in strength, and this strength was at least 4 ranks higher than him. He was shocked, and his experience in the game immediately made him realize what this thing was: a gargoyle? In the past, the guy who completed the quest did not mention that there was a gargoyle in the tomb. A gargoyle was the masterpiece of a Buga wizard, and it was a level 23 monster. Compared to it, a low-level lich was like a gentle baby. Before Brando could finish his thought, he felt himself being lifted up into the air, and it was a feeling of being in the clouds. He felt himself flying for a long distance, and then his back hit the cold wall of the tomb. All the bones in his body groaned as if they were broken one by one. But our protagonist did not have the time to worry about this. He got up and shook his head, and saw that the gargoyle was chasing after him like a ghost. Was there still a chance? P.S. Really, it's not that I don't want to explode. I'm just a few hundred points away. Chapter 26. The ferocious gargoyle was almost 2 meters tall when it stood up, and its demonic wings were more than 5 meters long even when it was half retracted. It almost occupied the entire space when it flew over, and a violent gust of wind swept across Brendel's face. Brendel's breath stopped, and he immediately found that there was no room for him to dodge. He immediately raised his right hand and shouted with all his might, "Ois!" A buzzing sound. In the narrow space, the air expanded forward and let out a sharp whistle. Bang 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 bang. 4 sounds were heard, and the shimmering crystals embedded in the wall of the tomb exploded. The whirlpool of wind hit the winged beast head-on, and the blade-like airflow hit the monster's iron surface. However, the gargoyle also bent half of its body and flew back like a kite with a broken string. In the distance, there was the sound of a heavy object falling to the ground, and smoke and dust flew in the corridor. Brando coughed in the smoke, grabbed his sword and rushed forward. His experience in the game told him that the gargoyle had 60 HP, and it was not something that could be easily killed by a wind bullet. Sure enough, he found the heavily injured gargoyle behind the smoke and dust. Half of its wing was completely shattered, and fresh blue liquid flowed out from it, forming a bright line on the ground. The monster opened its mouth and screamed at Brando, and its other claw was hanging down weakly. It seemed that it was injured. Kill it while it's injured. Brando did not think and took a step forward. He raised his sword with both hands and used all his strength to slash at the monster. The first slash hit the monster's chest, and it was caught off guard and forced to take a step back. The second slash followed the first, but the gargoyle reacted and spread its wings to surround him. The long sword drew a bright line of sparks on the steel-like wings. After using all his strength, Brando could only feel that the wounds on his body were about to burst open. However, he was not discouraged. The previous attack was to force the gargoyle into a defensive state. This was an opportunity, and Brando wanted to use this opportunity to go around the monster. But the gargoyle screamed and flapped its wings, and the power of 4OZ was enough to topple mountains and overturn seas. Brando lost his grip on the long sword, and the Roman sword flew out of his hand and hit the wall of the tomb, creating a few sparks, and fell to the other end of the corridor. He was thrown to the other side of the wall. He groaned, and his body felt like it was about to fall apart. The only thing that kept him awake was his mind. Brando suddenly realized that because of the monster's unexpected action, he was very close to Gerald's tomb. This thought was like a tranquilizer, and it cleared his mind, allowing him to know what he should do. He shouted and regained his strength. Enduring the intense pain that felt like he was going to be torn apart, he struggled to get up and ran in that direction. Gargoyles were mechanical creatures, usually in tomb guards, so there must be something that could command them. That was right, the gargoyle talisman. Its chance. The light in front of him was getting brighter, and the gentle white light was so warm that it could seep into his soul and calm him down. But Brando's heart was still pounding. He only had a few seconds to live, and success or failure depended on this one move. But he immediately heard the sound of a heavy object behind him. The young man's heart tightened, and his battle experience urged him to jump forward, but he was still a second too late. Brendel felt something tighten around his ankle while he was still in the air. The icy gargoyle actually stretched out its long claws and grabbed onto his foot, dragging him back to the ground. Brando fell heavily to the ground and coughed out a mouthful of blood. It was not that he had not experienced a worse situation than this in the game. But he had never been as anxious as he was now. Failure meant death. What should he do? The unyielding talent still had 10 seconds left. Should he take a gamble? This thought was like a ray of light that shone into his heart. He gritted his teeth and turned over, as if he was blessed with good fortune. He raised his right hand and aimed at the gargoyle with the ring on his index finger. 8 seconds. There was a trace of fear in the gargoyle's green eyes. It screamed and flew back, subconsciously releasing its claws from Brando. The wizard craftsmen of Buga were undoubtedly the smartest group of people in the world. The war creatures they created were powerful and cunning, but Brando took advantage of this at this moment. Wisdom was like a double-edged sword or an apple hanging on a tree that tempted people to fall. But once a creature had wisdom, it would know how to think, fear and protect itself. Just like now. Brando gasped for breath, he closed his eyes and he could not help but tremble. But our protagonist knew that he could not relax, he did not have much time left. 6 seconds. The young man almost used his willpower to support himself to turn over again. He crawled towards the tomb that was filled with a sacred atmosphere, and the first thing he saw was the sword on the sarcophagus, Thorn of Light. But he did not care about this now, he was looking for something else. 3 seconds. His eyes locked on the left side of the tomb, the second floor, the second compartment. He tore open the cobwebs and put his hand inside. A group of worms crawled out and he took out the bottle. It was a custom-made bottle number 12 from the Holy Cathedral, with a flame symbol on it. Brando turned over and could not help but put the bottle on his chest. He took deep breaths as if he wanted to use all his strength to feel this remaining blessing. There was still a moment left, the thumping of his heart reminded him. Brando almost trembled as he pulled out the cork of the bottle, and then he raised his head and poured the swaying liquid into his mouth. At first, a bitter taste filled his taste buds, but the taste was so pure that our protagonist could not help but praise the gods. Holy water number 7, 16 ounces. In the year of the new moonflower, the white-robed priest Tamara ordered the production of this type of holy water to cope with the increasing consumption on the front line. It was a substitute for holy water number 5. It could restore 25 HP, but it was only effective for non-fatal injuries. Brando remembered that this was the most common item in the game. The holy water immediately took effect. The first thing that healed was the abrasions on his limbs, which were almost healed at a speed visible to the naked eye. Then it was the sword wound, the itchy effect lasted for a few minutes before it stopped. Brendel tried to take a deep breath, and immediately found that the feeling of difficulty in breathing had completely disappeared. He opened his eyes and found that the gargoyle outside did not chase after him. Of course, this was not because it was afraid of the Ring of the Wind Empress. Brando guessed that it must be because the monster could not enter the tomb at all. With his experience in the game, he knew that many tombs of night had a corresponding sacred enchantment, which did not allow evil creatures to desecrate. He breathed a sigh of relief and sat up to check his injuries. The only remaining wound was the one that Brando suffered at the beginning. Because it was a fatal wound in his heart, the effect of the holy water number 7 was very limited. But it was enough. Brando stood up from the ground, he could not help but want to shout in excitement. This was the best state he had ever been in since he came to this world. There was no pain, the weakened state was gone, and he could use his body's strength as he wished. The young man could not help but let out a long sigh, his heart surging for a long time. Martha above, even in such a difficult situation he still managed to pull through. Even he could not believe it. What kind of pride and glory was this? He clenched his fists and it took him a lot of effort to calm himself down. Because he still remembered Freya and Irene, now was the time to carry out the next plan. Of course before that, he turned his head and his gaze fell on the shining sword on the stone coffin. It was the Thorn of Light. Leaf-shaped swords were not common in the human world because this was an elven sword. Brando looked up along the silver-braided gauntlet, and indeed saw 2 rows of fine elven words on the sword. The sword is born from the light, and all enemies are terrified. He had never seen this sword before but he knew its name. Legend had it that the Thorn of Light was a level 19 ancient longsword. Not only was it extremely sharp, but it could also increase the strength, willpower and vitality of the wielder by 1 ounce. What did it mean to increase strength and vitality by 1 ounce at a lower level? This meant that if Brando used it, his strength and vitality would be doubled. The most important thing was that someone had seen the Thorn of Light in the game, and it had the ability to detect the undead that many people dreamed of. As long as an undead approached the sword, it would emit a bright light, which was the origin of its name. Brando looked at the sword and sighed. In the game, the elves made a total of 17 similar swords, but most of them were destroyed by the Dark Lords of Madara at the end of the First Era. In the end there were only 3 left. This was one of them. He reached out and grabbed the hilt, and a surge of energy immediately entered his body. He felt that he had become stronger and his arms were lighter. But before Brando could fully appreciate the changes, a feeling appeared in his mind. Young man, you want to inherit my path? Brando's eyebrows twitched and he immediately realized what it was. The certificate of profession. This was the certificate of profession. The certificate of profession was not rare in the game, but it was what he needed the most at the moment. But Brando did not expect that the certificate of profession provided by the Knight of the Holy Church, Gerald, was a mercenary and not a knight of the church. What was going on? Discovered the certificate of profession mercenary. Requires 2 EXP to upgrade to level 1. Do you wish to take this job? Of course, even if he was not a knight, a mercenary was not bad either. At least it was better than being a militia, right? Take this job. A line of words lit up in his vision. Mercenary charge minus. Charge, a surprise attack on the enemy. Speed increased by 10 times. Cooldown, 1 minute. Cannot be used while in a weakened state. Brando could recite the effect of this skill even with his eyes closed. He was too familiar with it because this was the initial skill of the warrior class. Is this fate? Brando clenched his fist. He looked around the tomb. He was not interested in the belongings of the deceased. What he wanted was the holy water used to ward off evil spirits. This thing was too precious, it could save a life at a critical moment. But in the end, the young man's gaze stopped on a small ebony gargoyle. It was a statue. It was this thing. Brando was shocked. This was the gargoyle talisman, the key to controlling the gargoyle. He immediately picked up the talisman. If he could control a gargoyle, then it would be a pleasant surprise. It could even be the biggest reward of this trip. But at this time, the tomb shook violently, and the ceiling was filled with mud and sand. Brando turned his head and heard an explosion from a distance. It was from the direction of the ranch. He was shocked. Did something happen to Freya and Irene? This was the only possibility that Brando could think of. He couldn't wait to grab 2 bottles of less effective holy water number 9. He wrapped them in his blood-stained clothes and rushed out of the tomb. However, in his haste, he did not notice that a piece of paper had fallen from the holy water that he had casually swept away. Brando ran into the gargoyle as soon as he rushed out. But this time he had the gargoyle talisman, so the monster didn't dare to act rashly. It could only stand aside obediently as a statue. It was a pity that the talisman required a password to activate, otherwise he could have brought the gargoyle and killed his way out. Even though there were 2 necromancers in the Green Village, there was no place for them in front of a level 23 gargoyle. There was no other reason. The mechanical gargoyle couldn't be affected by the decay spell. The young man quickly ran out of the tomb, but before he could take a breath, a strong wind suddenly came from the darkness. P.S. Thank you for your support. It's finally on the front page. Here's the second update at 6 p.m. Since I'm so awesome, do you dare to support me more? Fate parted before my eyes into 2 straight lines that were not related to each other. One of them led to the burning palaces and cities. The kingdom was overturned, the land bore the burden of suffering. The living beings suffered in the fire, and they would never see the light of day again. The other leads to the top of the ancient kings. God personally crowns me in the clouds. I wear the laurel crown and bathe in the mountains. My eyes see through the fog of history. My knight expands my territory for me. My sword cuts through the thorns and leads my people to victory. I take this scepter and hold the power of the world in my hands. I look down on all living things and change the course of history. I am Brando, the King of Wonde. This is my legend. Which one do you prefer, this one or the current one? Chapter 27. Brando tilted his head and let the skeleton pass by him. He had almost forgotten about the skeleton in the meditation room, but he was no longer the same person as before. He placed his hand on the hilt of the sword. The sword flashed, and a layer of white light appeared on the thorn of light. Half of the skeleton's body flew into the air. Brando looked at the skeleton that was gradually turning into ashes. The thorn of light was indeed a sword that was born in light. It even had a purifying effect. A golden light shot into his chest. A weapon with a purifying effect would deal double the damage to the undead. No wonder he felt no resistance when his sword cut through the skeleton. It was like a hot knife cutting through butter. A divine weapon. Brando only had one evaluation of the sword. Even if it was not a divine weapon, it was not far from it in this environment. But he was more worried about Freya and Irene's safety. He immediately pushed away the crumbling skeleton and ran out. His 2-ounce agility was fully utilized at this moment, and he was not inferior to the world's top athletes in his previous world. In fact, he might even surpass them in terms of balanced explosive power. With the support of the Thorn of Light and the Ring of the Wind Empress, his strength, vitality and agility all broke through too. If Brando appeared on Earth now, there would only be one explanation in the eyes of a normal person. Superman, except for the fact that he could not fly. Brando went back the way he came from, and the twisting path in the darkness was no longer an obstacle to him. He leaped out from the collapsed walls of the temple, and the strong breath of life on his body immediately attracted the attention of the wandering undead nearby. Two skeletons on his left and right made cracking sounds as they wobbled towards him. But what awaited them were two silver swords. Brando kept the 2 EXP in his inventory and immediately looked towards the direction of the farm. His pupils immediately shrank. There was an obvious fire in that direction, and the fire almost dyed half the night sky red. In his vision, hundreds of skeletons were slowly surrounding that direction. He knew that these low-level undead would not act on their own. This meant that the lich behind them had noticed something. Freya, Irene. Brando's heart sank, but just as he was about to rush over, he heard a sharp and sinister voice behind him. "There's a human over there, kill him?" Brando turned his head and discovered a lich commanding 6 skeleton soldiers in a row to slowly approach him from one end of the street. The lich raised the bone staff in his hand. But Brando was faster than it. He activated his charge skill and closed in on it like a blur. "Stop him." The necromancer was startled and screamed hysterically. The skeleton soldier at the front raised its sword, but it was met with the cold face of the young man. A sentence suddenly flashed through Brando's mind. That sentence was so clear that it seemed to contain all the feelings of the original owner of this body. "Bastards of Madara, it's your turn to suffer." He did not care about techniques and directly used the elven sword to exchange blows. A metallic sound pierced through the eardrums. The steel sword in the skeleton soldier's hand bent backwards under the immense force and then broke with a clang. Brando charged forward. The skeleton soldier was split into 4 parts along with the sword. At this moment, there was no longer any obstruction between him and the lich. The repulsive undead opened its leaky lower jaw sluggishly. There was only astonishment on its withered face. "This sword is for Brando." He opened his mouth and the sword pierced through the lich's left rib and came out from the third rib on its back. The thorn of light was glowing. Brando stared at the lich's burning green eyes and said. He swung the sword from front to back. The soul fire in the lich's eyes flickered for a moment and then dimmed. With a clang, the arm that was holding the bone staff flew far away and was burned to ashes by the purifying fire. 3 golden lights rose from the night sky and merged into the young man's chest. He turned around and saw 2 skeleton soldiers flanking him from the left and right. Brando raised his sword and the first skeleton's arm immediately flew up. With another twist of the sword, the skeleton's head rolled down. He took advantage of the situation and pushed the rib that had already been purified towards its companion. The skeleton soldier immediately raised its sword to block the attack, but before it could raise its sword, a bright flash of a sword had already sliced it in half. Whoosh! Madara's lowest-ranked undead soldier's metal rings scattered all over the ground like a flower petals from the heavens. 2 spots of golden light flashed and disappeared. Brando immediately called out to his status panel. Rows of ghostly data immediately appeared in his vision. He selected one of them and said in his heart, Profession and EXP. A series of dark green data appeared, XP, 11, Commoner Level 1, Militia Level 2, 6 out of 10, Mercenary Level 1, 0 out of 10. He used his sword to block the skeleton soldier's attack and said in his heart, 11 EXP, Level Up Mercenary. The data immediately changed, XP, 0, Commoner Level 1, Militia Level 2, 6/10, Mercenary Level 2, 1 out of 130. Brando raised his sword and used his strength to push the skeleton soldier back. Then he glanced at his own attributes. Strength and constitution had increased by 0.2 ounces, dexterity and wisdom had also increased by 0.1 ounce. But the key point was still the 25 EXP. This point alone was enough to make the militia class lose its value. He took a deep breath. Well, now he had 2.3 ounce strength 2.1 ounce dexterity 2.2 ounce physique 8.0 ounces absolute strength. It had exceeded the player's initial attributes and had begun to move towards level 1 strength. At this moment, Brando's heart suddenly calmed down. He looked at the 3 skeleton soldiers in front of him as if he was looking at air. Yes, he was back. Finally, 10 minutes was enough for the smoke to dissipate. At the end of the street, the sound of horse hooves came from afar. 2 horses. On the long street, 2 young riders rode side by side. They stopped their horses and looked around. They were surprised to see the remains of skeletons on the ground. They were speechless for a moment. Zeta, did you see that? There's only one person. Is it Fortress Reden's guards? There's a necromancer over there. Martha is on top. Zeta, can you fight against 4 of them? No, I can't. This is an old soldier. The skinny young man on the horse looked around silently. A look of disbelief gradually appeared on his face. Ryan, there are 6 skeleton soldiers here. The surroundings became quiet. 7? 7. We have to tell this to the vice captain. What do you think this is? A regular soldier? Or a traveling knight? The young man called Ryan turned around and stared at his companion. I can't guess, Ryan, but I agree with your opinion. When Brando arrived at the ranch, it was already in a sea of fire. The burning buildings formed a bright background. Not far away there were occasional sounds of buildings collapsing. However, he did not see the undead army chasing after Freya and Irene as he expected. On the contrary, he saw many newly awakened skeletons fleeing in panic in the raging sea of fire. The bright flames were the natural enemy of these low-level undead. Their weak soul fire trembled under the strong light and was almost purified into ashes. This was not blue fire. In the game, Madara's army only used cold soul fire. Brando immediately realized that this fire was not set by the undead. Could it be Freya and Irene? He shook his head. He did not think that the 2 of them would be so decisive. He turned his head sharply in one direction and saw a group of skeleton soldiers chasing in a certain direction. He squinted his eyes and saw a layer of flickering black light on the skeletons. Was there a necromancer nearby? Brando immediately unsheathed his sword and the thorn of light glowed with a dim light. As he walked in that direction, a few reckless low-level skeletons brushed past him. Soon, our hero gained 7 experience points again. But before the young man could get close, a loud noise suddenly came from the corner in front of him. Countless bone fragments and metal rings scattered in all directions, accompanied by 2 or 3 skeletons that were thrown high into the air and fell into the sea of fire not far away. Brando was shocked. This was level 1 strength, 3 ounces, 20 ounces. He immediately realized. Who was behind the sea of fire? Humans? The regular army of Fortress Reden? But they did not appear here in the game. He instinctively got into a defensive position. When he looked up, he saw a group of knights rushing out from the sea of fire. It was like a flood, instantly sweeping out from the sea of fire. The leader of the riders immediately turned to him and raised his sword. The riders behind him pulled their reins at the same time. The whole group stopped in unison. Who are you? The knight coldly asked. It sounded like a young man. But the other party was immediately startled. Brando could not see the other party's expression because of the light, but he could feel that the person knew him. No, it was more accurate to say that he knew the original Brando. Then he heard the whispers of the knights behind him. I bet it's a militia. I know him. But you guessed right, it's really just a militia. Brando frowned slightly. When his eyes gradually adjusted to the strong light, he finally saw the attire of these people. Thick blue coat, dragon scale breastplate, shining white iron helmet and a knight's sword. There was also a silver badge with a black pine leaf insignia. Butchie's guards. Brando, why are you here? The leader of the knights asked in a condescending tone. I have the same question. Brando recalled this person's name from his memory, Breton, who was also a citizen of Bragg City like him. Because of his outstanding performance in the militia training, he was selected to join the guards and was sent to Butchie's border for training. Of course, this was only on the surface. Because no matter how outstanding Breton was, he would not be able to surpass Brando, who was the #1 swordsman in the same batch. But since the father of a local officer spoke up, the rest of the story naturally became smoother. He knew about the grudges between the two, but it was not grudges. At most, they looked down on each other. Sure enough, Breton immediately opened his mouth. Militia, as the vice captain of the Butchie Guards, I want you to report to me immediately. Why are you here? The group of knights immediately snickered. They knew that Breton was only trying to find trouble for his fellow countrymen. As for the report, it was just an excuse. Brando raised his head. Author's note, as promised, I'll do my best. Thanks to D-Blade, Blood Cicada, Lionhead, SJWJYB0, Green Knight Lions, Langarisa, Lontek, Juan 12387, Pirate Vanguard, Book Friend 08090309143337 Marshall St. Dragon, Moo Ruffing, Slothful Side, Meow Meow, Necromancer Apprentice for their generous rewards. Some of them are old friends that have supported me since Canaan, and some are new friends that I've met in Amber. I'd like to thank you for your support. Chapter 28. The raging flames continued to burn, and the golden-red flames formed a gradually darkening line at the edge of each person's face. Brando raised his head and looked at the young vice-captain seriously. He saw the same serious expression on the other party's face. The other party pursed his lips and stared at him without saying a word, as if he wanted to use a stern gaze to force him to submit. But no matter if it was Sophie or Brando, neither of them would fall for this trick. I am a militia from Anquis. May I ask Captain Breton, since when did Butchie's guards have the authority to issue orders to their allies from other jurisdictions? May I ask where is your order of appointment, my lord? The moment he opened his mouth, the knight behind Breton was stunned. Brando had fought for Erwin for 21 years in the game, so he was much more familiar with this country's laws and regulations than these brats. The young vice-captain thought for a moment and replied stubbornly, "Special times require special treatment." Brando knew that the other party could not bring himself to admit defeat, but he did not want to bicker with them. If not for Breton taking the initiative to cause trouble, he would have been too lazy to care about this childish dispute. "I am looking for Freya and Irene, have you seen them?" He raised his head and asked. This was the question that Brando was most concerned about. The surrounding fire seemed to be lit by the young guards, but he could not help but maliciously think that Erwin's future goddess of war would not be burned to death like this, right? "Breton, you have committed a great sin." Of course this was just a thought. But Breton felt that Brendel's nonchalant tone was arrogant, but he really could not think of anything to be proud of from a person who had fallen from grace, and who was not doing well in the world. He suppressed the disgust in his heart and opened his mouth. "Freya? The 3rd Militia Squadron? What is she doing with you?" Brando could tell that this guy had a good impression of Freya, but his unfriendly tone made him feel uncomfortable. As the saying goes, even a clay bodhisattva has a temper. "Captain Breton, it is my freedom to choose who I want to be with. As for what I'm doing here, I'm afraid I'm the same as you. Don't think I don't know what kind of situation you're in right now?" He couldn't help but retort. "Brat, what kind of attitude is this?" A young man behind Breton shouted angrily, "You're just a mere militia. The one in front of you is an officer of the garrison. Why aren't you straightening your posture?" Brando was startled by the scolding, but he raised his head and looked at the other party carefully. As if following his gaze, the row of riders in front of him turned solemn, as if they were trying to intimidate him. He looked at the 15 young men who stood upright on their horses like knives. They were uniformly dressed in dark blue military uniforms. Their armor was neat and shiny, showing the demeanor of an elite force. These youths have the right to be arrogant. They are the best youths from the villages and towns in the Grenoires region. After going through strict training and selection, the rest of them are at least close to first-tier strength. According to the rules of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, a person with an average strength between 3 ounces and 20 ounces could be considered as having level 1 strength. This level 1 strength system included all the white-ranked swordsmen, sorcerer apprentices and elementalists, beginner elementalists, in the entire continent as well as the knight squires of the Holy Church and the low-ranked clergy. The Holy Cathedral of Fire used the amber stone to test the purity of each person's strength. Brando had seen this kind of tool in the game before, but it was used by NPCs in that game. The players had direct data, so there was no need to test it. He had read some information in the game before. He knew that in the whole of Wonde, the number of people who had level 1 strength exceeded 60% of the total population. This was because the average lifespan here was more than 160 years. However, if the range was narrowed down to the age group of 17 to 19 years old, the same proportion would drop to 20% or even lower. In Erwin, apart from the church, sorcerer academies and knight squads, most of the 20% of people served in the garrison. Which was why he was looking at these people now. Indeed, in the face of a mixed group of militia, these young people could be arrogant. However, militia was militia and Brando was Brando. As a person who grew up in a free world, he was indeed an anomaly in this world, and he would never think of being inferior to others. This was the deep-rooted understanding of modern people: God is the greatest and I am the second. Thus, he coldly stared at this guy, secretly estimating his strength. Although his opponents were not ordinary, Brando believed that he was not inferior to them in terms of stats after obtaining the Thorn of Light and the Ring of the Wind Empress. Moreover, he also had the level 130 Veteran Warriors experience cheat, so he could guarantee that these guys would be defeated one after another. Of course they could swarm him, but Brando guessed that Breton could not afford to lose face. However, what surprised him was that the young vice-captain actually raised his hand to stop his team members, and asked with a heavy expression, "How do you know what we are here for? What else do you know? Who told you?" Brando thought to himself, of course I know. Why would Butchie's guards appear here, and what is their goal? The young man did not know every detail, but as long as he thought about the general direction of history, he would be able to guess most of it. He knew that they were not here to retaliate, but there had to be a motive, right? As long as he sorted out his thoughts and thought about how Butchie's guards were trying to break through Fortress Reden's encirclement, wouldn't everything make sense? This was the same as the game's history. In the game, it should be on this day that Madara's undead army completed their blockade of the Belder Forest. This afternoon or early afternoon, Butchie's guards and the escaping villagers were attacked by the undead army. That was the closest they were to Fortress Reden in history. They almost succeeded, but Kabia's skeleton army arrived and destroyed all their efforts. At this moment, Fortress Reden did not even realize that there was an invasion coming from the east. But this was not a coincidence, and it was not because luck was not on Butchie's side. It was because they were facing the terrifying and efficient left wing of Insursta's dragon army from the First War of the Black Rose. No matter how much they brought along their families, the weak, women and children, the Butchie guards could not match the speed of this famous undead army. Furthermore, they were being chased down by Rothko's necromancer army. These 2 points made their failure a tragedy. Brando looked at the young riders, their faces were covered in dust, and he guessed that this was the first time Marden was defeated. This veteran of the November War needed food and medicine to pacify the people so that he could break through the encirclement again. But the other side would not expect him to suffer a second and third failure so quickly. Marden still had a day and a half before One-Eyed Tarkus's main army arrived, and the tragedy would repeat itself. Perhaps he would be lucky enough to escape with his life, but he would lose all the glory of being a soldier. Brando shook his head and did not have the mood to argue anymore. But he was not a person who would repay evil with good, and he replied with disdain, "Do you still need to ask? You came here with such fanfare, isn't it written all over your face?" The young man behind Breton's back had veins popping out on his forehead. If not for Breton stopping him, he would have pulled out his sword and dueled with Brando. "You guessed right, but since you are not willing to take up the responsibility of a militia, please step aside." The young captain opened his mouth, "Please do not block our path." Wait, Brando could not help but feel a little angry. Is this guy trying to provoke me? He stood in the middle of the road and asked in a low voice, "Are the villagers with you?" "It has nothing to do with you." "How many people are injured?" Brando asked. Breton's face stiffened. "It has nothing to do with you." "Of course it has something to do with me. Among them are my friends' relatives, Freya, Petit Finus, Irene and Mackie. Their families are among them. Freya and the others are fighting to protect Butchie, but what are you fighting for?" Brando asked. "Listen carefully, I am not arguing with you, I just want to know an answer." His powerful words silenced all the young guards, and the whispers that they had been whispering to each other all this time disappeared. "Step aside, Brando," Breton said with a dark face. Brando's heart sank and a bad premonition arose. He shook his head. "Take me to see Captain Marden, I will look for Freya and the others. I will lead you out of this predicament, but before that you have to tell me, did something happen to the family of someone in the third squad?" Breton's face sank, and it was as dark as a storm cloud. "You?" The young captain almost squeezed out a few words from between his teeth. After he finished speaking, he turned around and waved to his team members, indicating for them to move in another direction. He did not want to say anything more to Brando, and he even regretted what he said before. Whenever he thought of the battle in the afternoon, he could not help but feel that it was the biggest nightmare of his life. He even suspected that this nightmare would haunt him for the rest of his life. Brando stood at the side, watching the group of knight leave silently. Various guesses flashed through his mind, but they all turned into one possibility. He could not help but shout, "Breton!" The young vice-captain stopped on his horse. "Is it Freya?" Breton's body stiffened, but he hesitated for a moment and nodded. "What happened?" "When you find Freya, help me pass on a message to her." "What?" Breton sighed. "If you find her, apologize to her on my behalf. Tell her that Aunt and Uncle Sil were unfortunate in the battle this afternoon." Just as he was about to say this, he suddenly heard a soft clang behind him. Everyone was startled. The knight turned around and saw Freya with a pale face, her sword falling to the ground. She had a look of disbelief on her face. The young man called Irene followed behind the future Valkyrie with a helpless look on his face. "Freya." Brendel was taken aback. He had already guessed what Breton was going to say with his mouth full of nonsense. "How is that possible, Aunt wouldn't?" Freya suddenly started sobbing. Her pale face was filled with tears. Everyone had a weak spot in their heart. When Brendel saw the strong Freya squatting down and crying pitifully like an injured animal, he felt as though the softest part of his heart was struck. His throat felt dry and he wanted to say something to comfort her, but he could not find the words to do so. He looked at her silently but suddenly realized something. Could it be that after going through the baptism of such a cruel war, that simple and kind-hearted country girl finally walked the path of becoming a Valkyrie? Then history was going back on track. Note: regarding professions and experience in the Amber Sword, the characters can take up any profession they want, just like in the real world. He can be a cook today, a tailor tomorrow, a warrior, or even a scout. But a person's time is limited. His experience in battles, adventures, and production is always limited. If a person can't focus on one profession, every time he takes up another profession, he will receive an experience penalty due to distraction. From the first profession, excluding commoners, onwards, the experience requirement for each profession will be doubled. Also, if there is no special explanation, the setting of the Wound World and the Amber Sword game are always the same. P.S. Strange, I can't see the reward list and the front desk doesn't show it fully. I can only thank everyone who supported me by donating. I feel like my collection is quite small. Readers, please help me promote more. Thank you. Next is my daily life. Please support me and let the Amber Sword continue to rise in the new books list. Chapter 29. The vast land was sleeping in the darkness and there was no sound. The silence seemed to be mourning for the souls that had passed away on this land. The stars were hanging upside down, and shooting stars crossed half of the purplish-red sky, as if symbolizing the names that had shone in the long river of history. Breton stood silently in the cold night wind, and one order after another came from his mouth. The guards galloped through the ruins of the green village, exterminating the remaining enemies. All the undead had to be purified. Everything. The young captain felt that this was the only way to make himself feel better. He looked at the time and he still had half an hour. Zeto looked at this scene from afar, and he shook the glass flask in his hand, and touched the young man beside him. Are you called Irene? Irene was slightly startled. My name is Zeto, do you want some? He raised the flat flask, pure clear lake fire wine. Ryan and I found it in a wine cellar. Unfortunately, I don't know if I can still drink it after this war. He paused for a moment. I used to have a dream. I wanted to be the best scout. But now I'm regretting it. Irene felt that this person was very strange, but she was a little interested in why he regretted it. A person wouldn't regret for no reason, right? What? She asked. My biggest goal was to discover the enemy because discovering the enemy was my value. But now what I want to do most is to hide the villagers. At least they won't be killed. But I can't do anything. It's not your fault. I'm a soldier. Zeto took a sip of the wine. When I saw that girl crying, I wished I could die on the battlefield like Corfinto. But I'm still alive and I can't escape. The young man was silent, and for some reason he subconsciously thought of Brando. He had an illusion that the young man who led them out of trouble could also lead them out of the shadows this time. Perhaps his premonition was true, and all the difficulties would be solved. Hopefully, he thought. Brando and Freya sat together. To be honest, Brando felt that he was not good at comforting people. He felt that it would have been better if someone else was here, but that damned Breton actually left with a sour face. Irene also stayed far away and refused to come over. Hey, isn't that your captain? Fortunately, Freya quickly adjusted her emotions, but she kept staring in a certain direction. Her usually bright eyes were now filled with loneliness. Brando recognized that kind of desolation. He had seen the same kind of gaze on the Valkyrie, a gaze that flowed with quiet sadness as if it would never disappear. However, he suddenly felt that it was a pity. Compared to her, he preferred the innocent, soft-hearted, and somewhat persistent Freya, the Freya who could get angry over small things. But how was he supposed to open his mouth? He hesitated for a long time, but when the words reached his mouth, they seemed pale and powerless. He had prepared several lines, but none of them were suitable. Just as he was having a headache, the girl spoke first. Mr. Brando, she called out. Tell me, why is there a war? He really did not seriously think about this question. In the game, the large guilds would go to war because of the distribution of benefits, reputation, and even face. Countries would fight for benefits, sovereignty, and territory. The flames of war would spread across the land at any time. In the past, he might have answered that it was because humans were creatures that were always controlled by their desires. They yearned to conquer and plunder, and thus were always fighting against each other. But after experiencing everything today, especially Freya's weak cry, it was forever imprinted in his heart and could not be erased. He suddenly realized that this answer was laughable, because no one could surpass their own race. Humans were both weak and strong. War will happen and we can only choose to accept it. We were born in a very bad era and we cannot choose our era. But we can try to change it. Brando answered. As he said that, he suddenly felt a sense of relief because of his own words. Perhaps we can't change anything, but at least we've fought together with many others to achieve it. Such memories are already precious enough. He recalled the days when he fought for Erwin in the game. Many friends, many like-minded companions, many vows, even though they all left in the end, at least he had countless memories, and never once regretted his loss. Those were memories that belonged to Erwin. He couldn't forget them for a very long time. The girl fell silent. Freya. Huh? You must love them very much. Yes. The girl answered, after my father passed away, Auntie Sil had always taken care of me, they were proud of me. But I'm the same, I love them more than anything. But I'm very curious, why did the heavens choose you? Brando asked. Chem? Freya, if one day you become the protector of this land, have you ever thought about it? How is that possible, Mr. Brando? Are you secretly laughing at me? The girl was a bit angry, but her voice became softer. I want to be a good leader, but my strength is only so much, so little. I only want to fulfill my responsibility, I can't do it if it's too far away. No, not only did you do it, you did it very well. Freya, you will be Erwin's last hero, and also the one that people will miss the most. Humble, serious, strong, kind, the heavens gave you ordinary talents, but also gave you the best qualities and unique experiences. Brando turned the black sandalwood gargoyle statue over and over in his hand, staring into the distance and sighed. Freya, I don't know how far you'll go in the future, but I want you to remember one thing. Chem? Do you know the word, companions? No matter how far you go, there will always be many people to accompany you. You will never be alone. Freya was startled, and suddenly her eyes were filled with sorrow. She thought of the Roman, Petit Finus, Irene and Mackie, and everyone in the 3rd Militia Unit. Of course there was also Aunt Sil. She wiped the corner of her eyes and looked up at the sky. The night was divided into two by a red curtain. The green village was burning, and the raging flames in the darkness seemed to indicate a greater catastrophe. Thank you, she replied softly. Shameless Brando. Our hero choked. But when he turned around, Freya's eyes were bright, like the stars in the night sky. At that moment, Brando suddenly felt that his existence was valuable. At least history was different now, wasn't it? Breton quickly got what he wanted, food and medicine. Although the green village was almost completely destroyed, it was not difficult to find these things. The undead did not need food or medicine, and these things were just casually piled up there. Moreover, they had Brando with them. Even though Bucci, Verbin and Green Village were all under the jurisdiction of the Bucci garrison, the youths who were familiar with the garrison could not compare to Brendel. Brando easily found the secret cellars of the two squires' manors with his memories. Other than food and medicine, there were also other materials such as pig iron, copper and even gold and silver. But they could not bring the extra things, so they could only seal the cellars as they were. Perhaps they could still be used in the future. Of course, it was not Brando's habit to return empty-handed, especially as a player. The owners of these manors died in the war, and they did not have any descendants. Brando knew that these manors were later burned down by the undead of Madara. Those secret cellars later became the hottest thing for players, and as long as they found one, they could make a small fortune. This was why he was so familiar with the location of these cellars. Players were always creatures that did not wake up early if there was no profit. But he could not bring the big things, but he definitely could not let go of the magic equipment. Under everyone's surprised gaze, he opened a few secret compartments. Most of them were gold, silver, and jewels, but our protagonist did not care about those things. In the game these were all wealth, but on the battlefield they were worthless except for being a burden. The young vice-captain's face darkened, and he looked at him suspiciously. When did this guy learn to be a burglar? But with his personality he would not degrade himself, right? At this time, Brando took out a set of female half-body armor. This was a set of retro armor, the bright surface was decorated with complicated brass ornaments, and the black and gold patterns showed that it was a work of art in the style of the year of the return of glory. But before everyone could look away from this beautiful armor, Brando took out another set of armor from nowhere. Then he waved to Freya. Freya, come here. Our future Valkyrie was slightly startled. Try on this set of armor. Wait, Breton could not help but sneer. Brando, you can't be thinking of letting Freya wear that set of armor, right? Not all armors are meant to be used in actual combat, do you understand? Brando was too lazy to pay attention to him. He took the armor and was about to put it on Freya. But the girl blushed, swayed her ponytail and took the armor and said, I'll do it myself. He was stunned. In the game he did not pay much attention to this. He and his female knight and warrior companions helped each other put on their armor, but he forgot that this was reality. What are you thinking? Breton saw Freya run to the pile of wood and could not help but ask. What? That is a work of art, it's too heavy? You can't be thinking of letting Freya wear it in battle, right? Besides, have you militia learned how to fight in armor? Too heavy? This was the first time Brando heard of this. He could not help but look back at the young vice-captain, wondering if his brain had been flooded with water. He did not explain further and waved for Freya to come over, then helped her put on the armor. Then he asked, how does it feel? It's a bit heavy, it's not very flexible. The youths behind Breton snickered. How could such an obvious piece of armor not be heavy? Of course, most of these snickers were kind, but there were also some who were mocking him. Brando ignored them and said to the armor, Taz. This word was an ancient word, meaning wind. The armor was instantly covered by a layer of green light, and with a whoosh, it floated up from Freya's body and tightly protected her body. The girl was slightly startled and shouted in surprise, This? Brando turned back. The Wind Empress armor is infused with the wind element, and someone actually said that it's too heavy. Presumably, the elven craftsman who designed this armor would not rest in peace even if he died, right? Breton's face was as gloomy as water, while the young knight behind him was speechless. Chapter 30. As Breton brought the food and medicine back to Brando's acquaintance, the veteran Marden, or rather the current Butchie garrison Captain Marden's base in the Belder Forest, the return of the 3rd Militia Unit caused a commotion in the valley. Mackie, Ike, Irene, Bertha, Petit-Finus, and the Niberto brothers were all the eldest sons or daughters of their respective families in the village. Their families originally thought that they had perished in the battle that night, and had even prepared themselves to accept this reality. But now they had returned alive and well. The refugees were in an uproar, although not all of them were Butchie residents. Some of them might have come from the Green Village or Verbin, but the enthusiastic atmosphere still affected everyone. After all, this was the first good news they had received in 2 days. A good omen could indicate that the coming days would be smooth sailing. Furthermore, with the food and medicine that came with it, the hungry and cold could eat warm meals, and the injured could be cared for. Everyone felt that hope was not far away, and even forgot about the embarrassing and tragic situation in the afternoon. Humans always yearned for a better life, and even if it was only a little better than now, they would still be satisfied. Some people said that humans were insatiable, and they were indeed insatiable, but they were also the easiest to satisfy. Marden ordered a bonfire to be lit. This veteran of the November War was brave and stubborn, and would definitely not submit to a few skeletons from Madara. He did not mind that Cabias and Rothko had discovered them, and according to his words, they could come at them as they pleased. Erwin was not a coward. With so many people who had not undergone military training, it was impossible to hide, so he might as well be generous. On the other hand, the suddenly lonely Freya was suddenly treated like a hero. At first, Brando was worried that she would be reminded of the past, but he quickly discovered that it was unnecessary. Freya, it's all thanks to you guys. Freya, don't be sad, you still have us. Everyone in the village will support you, you're a strong and good girl, everyone knows that. Freya, are you hurt? Come, let Auntie Akasha take a look, why are you so careless? A plump middle-aged woman parted the crowd. Although she had the rough and loud voice of a country bumpkin, she could not hide the concern on her face. She parted the fringe in front of Freya's forehead and wiped her face. She took a step back and looked at the girl carefully. Auntie Akasha, I'm fine. Really? If you have anything to say, don't keep it to yourself. Really, thank you everyone. Freya looked at everyone around her. A layer of fog inadvertently blocked her vision. In fact, these people had not had a good time in the past 2 days. Every one of them was frightened and their eyes were bloodshot. But right now they were showing the most sincere kinship between people. Brendel watched this scene from afar and felt an inexplicable warmth in his heart. The warm bonfire, the connection between people, and the aroma of food in the air seemed to dispel the darkness and coldness of the mountain. Even if it was only for a moment, it was enough to make people sigh with emotion. What a wonderful scene. The relationship between people should be so simple. Brando leaned against a white craggy rock and looked up at the stars in the sky. One by one they were like diamonds sprinkled on a dark purple curtain. Why don't you go over? He saw Roman sitting at a higher place, her hands holding her bag on her leather skirt, a pair of round leather shoes swinging back and forth in the air. They don't like me. What? Auntie and I are strange people in their eyes, and no ordinary girl wants to be a merchant. So it's normal that they don't like them. You know that too. Brando said in his heart, but he suddenly realized that he had no impression of Roman's auntie, because that woman was always out, here one day, there the next. She would only come back occasionally and bring some strange things that Roman liked. Perhaps it was because of her independent upbringing that this future merchant lady had such a unique personality. Can you tell me about your parents? I don't think you've told me about them before. I've never seen them. For as long as I can remember, my auntie has been by my side. Auntie said, little Roman, when you grow up you have to repay auntie. Romaine giggled, reflecting the moonlight, her eyes were bright and clear. Brando was stunned. After listening to her, he calmed down. So that's why you want to be a merchant? Yes. What a strange way of thinking. It's okay. The two of them chatted for a while before Brando saw Freya come over. That young girl appeared to be pure, simple, and approachable in front of everyone, but once she changed back to being the captain of Butchie's 3rd militia unit, she had a faint sense of responsibility like a future Valkyrie. She promised to bring Brando to meet Captain Martin of Butchie's garrison, although she didn't know what this young man wanted to do. But just like Irene, she had a blind trust in him, believing that as long as it was this young man, he would definitely have a way to get everyone out of this predicament. Freya didn't want to rely on anyone, she was just curious. And Brando's plan was like this. Now that he had coincidentally met up with Butchie's garrison and the refugees, and he also knew what kind of failure Captain Martin would encounter, then standing at this point in history, of course he had to do something. Indeed, Brando's first thought was to protect himself, but a person couldn't live alone in this world. If he did that, how would he face the Roman? How would he face Mackie and Petit Finus? How would he face Freya? What's more, the future Valkyrie's helpless cries had deeply moved him. Who would have so many misgivings in one life? Moreover, he had lived 2 lives, he just wanted to have no regrets. After thinking through this point, Brando felt that the road in front of him had opened up. The Roman naturally wouldn't leave his side. The 3 of them passed through the valley, passing through groups of 2s and 3s, and finally found the old man beside a campfire at the end of the valley. Coincidentally, or perhaps as expected, Breton was also there. But Brando didn't care about this guy. Instead, his gaze fell on the veteran of the November War. Martin. According to the time in the game, Brando suddenly remembered that he hadn't seen this old man for almost 30 years. The time ratio was 8:1. In the game, Martin's later years were extremely unsatisfactory, but he still died of old age. His only fortune was that he didn't personally witness Erwin's defeat, and also gained the friendship of many players. This NPC had an extremely high prestige among the players, because he taught many skills such as stealth, scouting, and swordsmanship. Most importantly, he also taught the first advanced warrior skill, Battle Cry of Courage. The old man didn't look much different from Brando's memory, he didn't even look that old, but the determination on his face was even stronger. Brando had interacted with this veteran for a period of time, so he knew his temperament. He knew that this was an extremely determined and fearless soldier with a fiery temper. Therefore, any euphemism wouldn't work in front of him, so he might as well be straightforward and directly state his intentions. Maybe he could win some goodwill. But when he opened his mouth, he still felt a little apprehensive. Who knew if the character of this world was the same as the character in the game? Although he thought that it should be the same, he felt that it was a little inconceivable. After listening to his statement, Martin's eyebrows moved. Of course, it was a frown. But as expected, the first to raise an objection was the young vice-captain of the guards. Breton. You mean that we will fail? What's the reason? Brando's gaze stopped on Martin, and he heard the old man say, Young man, I am very grateful that you want to join us and do your best for the kingdom. But you don't seem to have much hope for the upcoming battle. I would also like to hear. Brando didn't panic, he was most worried that this hot-tempered old man wouldn't give him a chance to speak. As long as he opened his mouth, as someone who was familiar with the development of history, he was confident that he could convince the old man. Actually, I only have one question. Do you know how many undead soldiers of Madara are blocking your path? The few young men from the garrison force who were sitting there were all silent. Martin also didn't speak, but Breton answered after he saw Martin's eyes. From the battle in the afternoon, it should be the same undead army that started to bite us. Later on, another undead army joined in and I took note of their flags. There should be at least 2 different commanders. Unfortunately, I don't know the specific organization of Madara. Our protagonist looked at this guy in surprise. He couldn't tell that this guy actually had some real ability. Unlike his previous life's experience, Breton only needed to observe the chaotic battlefield for a bit to come to this conclusion. It was quite amazing. But this didn't make Brando think highly of him because unfortunately, Brando happened to be the one who knew more than him. "You don't know much about Madara. It's not strange for you to come to the wrong conclusion," he said with assurance. "This is a country that has never been truly unified. Before the era of runes and swords, a group of exiled dark magi came here and became the first lord of this area, and for a long time, this place was a paradise for bandits and undead wanderers. Why are you saying all this? Listen to him, Breton, don't be impatient." Brando smiled. He knew that he could attract Martin's attention. An old soldier was an old soldier. No matter how bad his temper was, he could always grasp some crucial information. But at the same time, it is an extremely aggressive country. Those lords who live in the darkness are constantly fighting each other, and at any time, they would plunder from the north, south or any direction. Erewhon, Cruz, Osir, and even the Banlin area have suffered greatly. Years of war have allowed the Lords of the Darkness to have battle-hardened troops. Although their organization is extremely chaotic, their fighting strength is not to be underestimated. Therefore, when you see 2 different units with different designations, their scale may also be vastly different. So, can you describe to me the details of your battles? Maybe I can provide you with some information. Brando. Breton finally couldn't help but stand up. He angrily rebuked, "You're lying. How could you know about Madara's situation? As far as I know, you dash." He wanted to say something, but was stopped by the young man's stern gaze. Breton was stunned for a moment. He couldn't believe that he was shocked speechless by Brendel's gaze. The Brando of the past wasn't so strong. He was just a young boy with some talent. "Listen, Breton, I'm not here to argue with you." Brando replied word by word, "I don't expect you to understand what kind of critical situation this is, but I just want you to know that you have to be responsible for your actions." Breton was speechless and then he exploded in anger. "Tell him what we encountered, Breton." Martin opened his mouth and the old soldier's brows were deeply furrowed. Note, Act 18, Taz in Elven language. P.S. The last few chapters have been very good. I don't know if everyone has the same feeling as me. Also, I would like to thank my readers for their support in recommending my books. I appreciate it. Chapter 31. Breton sat down and shot a glance at Brando. In his heart he was certain that this guy was lying. He and Brando were part of the same batch of militia in Anquis. Although they had not met during their time in Bragg's, they had a rough understanding of each other's experiences. As the son of a miller, even if his grandfather was a knight in the November War, and his mother had a bit of noble blood, what extraordinary experiences could he have had? Afterwards he was transferred to the garrison, and it was said that this kid was going to take over his father's position. But for some reason he actually came to Butchie and stayed there for a year. It was obvious that this year did not allow him to gain much knowledge, but if this kid wanted to lie, he would have to consider whether he could fool Martin. Breton turned his head to look at his captain. Although his old captain had a bad temper and was stubborn, he was very astute. He could easily expose a lie with a few words. After all, soldiers who could survive the November War from beginning to end were not simple people. After Breton sat down, another young guard felt that the atmosphere was a little awkward, so he added on to Breton's previous words. What he said was the details of the encounter during the day until the afternoon. The people around him nodded in agreement or added a few words. In the group, only Breton and the old captain remained silent. Brando knew that Martin had a bad temper, and almost scolded him when he opened his mouth. But at the crucial moment he was able to calm down. This was the quality of a veteran, but his silver-gray eyebrows occasionally moved slightly, showing the anxiety in his heart. As for Breton, he had made up his mind to watch from the sidelines. After hearing their description, Brando knew who they had encountered. The army that had followed them from Butchie should be the necromancer Rothko. In the game, Rothko was an extremely talented necromancer. This nickname was given to him by the players. His innate skill was necromancy. Undead that were summoned were easier to turn into necromancers. Thus, his army had a special characteristic: they replenished their troops quickly. Although they did not have strong offensive capabilities, they were patient and cunning. They were good at using cannon fodder to wear down the enemy and polish their morale. At this time, Rothko should still be an apprentice necromancer. Brando guessed that his position in Targus' attack order would not be higher than the position of a squadron leader. In fact, his guess was not far from the truth, but he would never have thought that he had already met the other party from afar, on the night they escaped from Bucci. As for the other unit, there was no need for him to guess. In history, the unit that razed the Green Village to the ground was Cabia's. This skeleton wasn't famous in Madara's history, but he was a veteran. At this time, he should have been one of Targus' generals. This meant that Rothko's squadron should have more than 200 soldiers, and there should be at least 20 liches. As Cabia's main force, it should have at least a fifth of Tarkus's left-wing forces. Such a large force would not only consist of skeletons, but also black samurai and pale knight. Fortunately, the undead army had to seal off several paths in the forest, so their forces couldn't be concentrated in one place. Today, the refugees should have encountered half of Rothko's company and one of Cabia's company. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to escape so easily. Of course, it was impossible for Brando to go into such detail, or else the source of the information would be problematic. The previous information could be attributed to legends, anecdotes, or even stories, but it was impossible for him to know the enemy's forces so clearly. Being a prophet was also a skill. He decided to go back to the previous topic. He paused and said, "I don't know if you have heard of Anse, but it is the headquarters of the necromancers. In fact, Madara is divided into 3 factions. One is the vampires and the other is the necromancers. I won't explain these 2 factions, but you should have heard of their legends. The remaining faction is also a faction that holds considerable power. We call them the Dark Lords. When they were alive, they were robbers, bandits, Knight of the Templar who committed crimes, nobles who were expelled from the human world, or undead wanderers. They believe in the Dark Codex and are the traditional rulers of Madara." "It's novel, but it's just a story," a guard replied. "No, you imagine that when one person unifies these 3 factions, Madara will rise from the darkness. Coincidentally, they have a prophecy about this. But you said before that this country has never been truly unified." "In the past, yes, but this opportunity is now in front of us." "But what does that have to do with us?" "Of course, have you heard of the legend of the Mercury Staff?" Brando suddenly changed the subject. "The Mercury Staff in the prophecy, the one that is said to unify the Dark World if someone obtains it?" one of the guards asked. Brando nodded. "Its full name is Loki's Mercury Staff. Let me tell you who Loki was. He was a genius necromancer, and in his time he almost completed the great task of unifying Madara. But it was all in vain, and then the whereabouts of the staff became a mystery, leaving only a legend that when someone obtains it, they will become the king of the Dark World again. But since this spring, someone has seen the Mercury Staff appear in Anse's place." "Wait," Breton's expression changed. "The rumor from a few months ago is true?" "A few months ago? Ah, I remember now. It seems that a merchant brought news from there, saying that someone with a strange staff opened some kind of door." "The Door of Sighs," Brando added. "That's Loki's treasury where his throne is." The old guard captain frowned deeply. "Boy, although I don't understand the intrigue between those big shots, you're saying that there's a big change in Madara? That's wonderful. At least this means that Madara came prepared this time. Although I don't know what their goal is, at least it won't be a small-scale plunder and invasion, right? It sounds ridiculous, but it's not impossible." He placed his calloused hand on his knee, which was very close to his sword. "Breton, do you know this young man?" Breton was stunned. He knew that if he voiced his suspicions, although the captain wouldn't immediately stab him with his sword, he would at least capture him and make it impossible for him to explain. He couldn't help but glare at Brando, not hiding the ridicule in his eyes. But after thinking about it, he didn't choose to do so. "I know him, and I also think that he's lying. But my rationality tells me that this person has no reason to deceive us. What if he's already been bribed by Madara?" Martin asked again. "It's not that I haven't considered it, but considering his experience with Freya and the others, if Madara's commander can plan so far ahead, then I don't think I lost unjustly." "Very good, Breton." Martin patted his vice-captain's shoulder. It wasn't just Martin, even Brando couldn't help but glance at this young vice-captain. It seemed like this guy wasn't completely useless. Of course, he wouldn't be able to change his impression of him, and he was too narrow-minded, so he wouldn't be able to achieve anything. He used his God's eye view to judge Breton. Of course, if Breton knew what Brando was thinking right now, he would definitely regret his words of fairness. But even if Breton denied or slandered him, it wouldn't matter. Brando had his own ways to convince Martin. As someone who could foresee the future, he was already standing on a higher level. It was just that it would take a lot of effort to convince him, and he might even leave behind something that could be used against him. Alright, let's get back to the main topic. Martin opened his mouth. Kid, so you think that Madara's target is Fortress Reden? In the Grimoires region, Erwin can only rely on Fortress Vermeer. And Fortress Reden protects the flank of this defensive line, so Madara's target can only be Fortress Reden. Brando nodded. Martin couldn't help but rub his nose and scold. Since Madara has already made up his mind, then the ones that caught us before shouldn't be small fries, right? Damn it, why do we have to bear a bunch of bad luck? I don't know the specifics, Brando said in his heart. But from your description, the ones that followed us before should be an undead army led by a necromancer. And the ones that came after them should be the Dark Lord's army. The necromancer's army uses liches as their base unit, so it's very easy to distinguish. From your description, it should be half a squadron. The Dark Lord's army is more chaotic, but from the soldiers that the Green Village reserved, there should be at least 2 squadrons. That's about right. Martin nodded. What he didn't know was that Brando had already reduced the number by half. But even so, everyone couldn't help but feel anxious. Against such a large undead army, how could they succeed with only 30 guards and a group of weak women and children? The old captain also sighed. All right, Brando. Since you're here to tell us this, can I assume that you already have an idea in mind? I don't mind telling you that if the situation is as you said, I don't have the confidence to bring these people out. Freya let out a low gasp when she heard this. But Brando nodded. I have an idea. Everyone's gaze was focused on him. Even Breton, who didn't trust him, couldn't help but be shocked. Brendel sucked in a breath of air nervously. In the end, he had just gained some confidence, and this kind of attention still made him feel a little pressured. He suddenly realized that every word he was about to say could affect the life and death of many people. Should he be more cautious? He couldn't help but remind himself to calm down and not to forget anything. Everyone can go north and cross the River of Daggers. He answered. River of Daggers? That place, why? Brendel hesitated for a moment. How can I explain why the White Knight Ebden and Corpse Ghoul Wadon were 2 days late in coming to surround this place? P.S. Sorry it's even later. The next chapter might be a little late too. Chapter 32. Brando's mind raced. It would be great if he had some sort of scouting ability. For example, Eagle Eye, Omen, Deadman's Vision, or Detection. But when he thought of scouting, he suddenly thought of a possibility. That's right, it's that. He couldn't help but clench his fists and loosen them to calm himself down. Because the River of Daggers is practically undefended, and there's only a squad of undead stationed there. Why wouldn't I break through in that direction? Everyone's first reaction was almost the same. What, is that true? How is that possible? How do you know? Brando raised his hand to silence everyone. Of course I know. Breton, do you remember the half-broken statue you found in the Green Village? That's the one that looks like a demon, heavy and heavy. Breton suddenly came to a realization. Zeta and Ryan had found the item under the collapsed Kaladesh shrine. They had heard that they had discovered traces of a knight nearby, so they had searched the area and found the item. Brando took out an ebony statue from his pocket. That's called a gargoyle, I'm sure you've heard of it. It's one of Buga's basic combat units, and the wizards control it through this thing. He placed it on his open palm so that everyone could see it clearly. Most of the young guards had participated in the operation in the Green Village, and they immediately recognized that this little thing was exactly the same as the statue. Wait, you're saying you can control that thing? Someone asked. But can it move? It has wings, can it fly? The scout called Zeta stared at Brando from the back and asked. Of course it can fly, and it's not any slower than a wyvern. You know our wyvern knight, right? Their position in Buga is similar to that of a wyvern knight, and they're the best scouts on the battlefield. I use it to open up a path to avoid large groups of undead. Yesterday morning, I noticed that Madara's army in the north was in trouble. They had at least 3 squadrons stranded in Verbin, and they couldn't seal off the north bank of the river in time. Furthermore, due to the problems with their coordination, I believe that the 2 undead armies in front of us are still unaware of the mistake made by their comrades in the north. Unfortunately, when I was investigating further, the gargoyle was discovered by the troops stationed there. It was attacked and damaged. When I ordered it to return, it crashed in Green Village. After Brando said that, Freya suddenly reacted. So that's how it is. Brando, at that time, you said that you had personal matters to attend to. No wonder you could always lead us to avoid danger. No wonder you insisted on going to the Green Village even though you were seriously injured. You wanted to fix that thing. Why didn't you tell us? Just as Brando was about to explain, the future Valkyrie lowered her head. I'm sorry, Brando. I was wrong too. At that time I was still angry with you, but I didn't know that you were thinking for everyone. Brando felt that he was a genius, to be able to come up with such a story in a hurry. However, to be able to make Freya connect the dots from the beginning to the end, it was hard to say whether he was too smart or Freya was too stupid. Seeing her apologetic expression, Brando suddenly felt a little embarrassed. However, after hearing Freya's words, the people who originally believed 80% of it were now completely convinced. Freya was the best militia in this batch, and Martin had a good impression of her. Furthermore, she was from Wuxia, so she couldn't possibly lie to them, right? Even Breton couldn't help but rub his eyebrows and ask, "Can that thing move again?" It's hard to say, but I'll try my best. I've already re-established a connection with it, and all that's left is for it to slowly recover. Brando spoke without thinking. He thought that if it could move, he wouldn't be here talking nonsense with her. Not to mention the Lich, even Rothko himself would have a hard time dealing with a level 23 gargoyle. Breton wasn't satisfied with this answer. You're really hopelessly stupid to be able to control a gargoyle in the sky and still be discovered by others. If only we had a scout in the sky right now, things would be much better. So someone's ability is to shirk responsibility? Is it because you won't fight without me? Brando taunted. Alright, stop arguing, we still have to fight our own battles. However, kid, we believe that what you said is true, but Madara's advance party is still in front of us, eyeing us covetously. Do you really think that we can escape with a few hundred people? Martin muttered to himself and asked. That's your responsibility, Captain Martin. Well said. This veteran of the November War couldn't help but look deeply at Brando. He felt that it was a little strange, as if this kid knew what he was thinking. Every time he opened his mouth, he would say something that tickled him. It was like when you wanted to perform in an opera, someone would immediately set up the stage for you. He couldn't help but think that if this kid changed his profession and became the Emperor's jester, he would definitely have a bright future. However, only the heavens knew that Brando knew his character like the back of his hand. Thinking of this, Martin had already stood up and ordered in a deep voice, I order the Wuxia garrison to gather here, and prepare to break out of the encirclement. The surroundings became solemn, and then the guards stood up with a swoosh. Martin then turned his head and said, Zeta, go tell the villagers to gather their men. Now it's time for the men of Erewhon to protect their homes and loved ones. Zeta was stunned and turned his head. Captain? What are you looking at? Are you afraid of death in the end? Let me tell you, now it's time for you to fulfill your promise. Young lads of the Wuxia garrison, before dawn, we will launch an attack on Madara's vanguard. I predict that none of you will survive, but it doesn't matter because the villagers of Wuxia will bring our bravery out, and tell everyone in the outside world that we are not afraid of death, and have already fulfilled our responsibilities. In Brando's eyes, this veteran of the November War swept his gaze across everyone's face, his expression solemn. My former commanding officer always told me that dying to protect others without losing honor is the fate of a soldier. Now, I'm giving this sentence to all of you and I hope that you will remember this honor. So, go do what you have to do. Breton, I want you to lead the rest of the villagers to break out of the encirclement at the River of Daggers. I only have one request, do you understand? I understand. Breton's eyes flashed with a trace of light, but he still lowered his head and answered. Very good. Martin nodded. Kid and Freya, the two of you. I want you to immediately join the Wuxia garrison as militia. Do you have any objections? Freya immediately shook her head. But Brando nodded in front of everyone. I have an objection. Martin paused for a moment. Speak. He could not help but look at Brendel. But if you're a coward who's afraid of death, then you can get the hell out of here. Wuxia's guards will never accept cowards. There was a burst of low laughter, but surprisingly, Breton did not say a word. Brando turned his head to look at that guy and was somewhat surprised. But his gaze fell on the Roman, and he remembered the merchant girl's words. I've never seen them before. For as long as I can remember, it was my aunt who was by my side. She said, little Roman, when you grow up, you have to repay her. So you want to be a merchant? Yes. What a strange idea. It's fine. Brando smiled in his heart and raised his head. Captain Martin, your decision from Butchie's point of view is not a problem, but have you forgotten a problem? What problem? Martin was stunned again, and he was even more curious about this kid. The 3 towns of Butchie are the buffer zone of Fortress Reeden, and the garrison of Butchie has always been the sentinel of Fortress Reeden. If we choose to leave, then what will happen to Fortress Reeden without any warning? If you say that we're doing our duty, then I don't think so. Brando spoke frankly, but the expressions of the others gradually changed. He was right. If that was the case, then they really did not do their duty. If Madara was lucky enough to break through Fortress Reeden's defense line, then the defense system of Fort Vermeer Fortress Reeden would be in danger, and the whole Grimoires region would be under the attack of the undead army. Thinking that one day Madara's army would arrive at Bragg's, the youths could not help but be speechless. But what could they do? We've already done our best. Under the circumstances, we can only do so much. It's not that we gave up on Fortress Reeden, it's that Fortress Reeden gave up on us. Martin stared at Brando, and he knew that if this young man was willing to say it, then he must have a solution. Yes, I know of a way to break through to Fortress Reeden. Although the chances are slim, it's better than nothing. Brando spoke as if he had squeezed out all the air in his chest, and he let out a deep breath. He turned back to look at the Roman, and the future merchant girl lowered her head, thinking about something, and grabbed her bag anxiously. Which one? The Zevel Mountain Path. Martin could not help but take a deep breath. Although he searched his memory, he still subconsciously avoided this place. He wanted to remind Brando and ask him if he knew the dangers of this place. The mountain path was in the south of the Belder Forest, passing through the Pine River Valley, and was close to the border between Erewhon and the Barbarian Forest. Once they crossed the valley, they would reach the edge of civilization, and there would be no end to it. Ever since the year of the Howling L350, no one who entered the valley had ever come out alive. There was a rumor that there was a dragon in the valley. He felt that attacking Madara would at least give him a chance of survival, but sending his men there would be like throwing meat buns at a dog. He thought for a while and still could not get rid of this deep-rooted thought. That's a dead-end, young man. The old soldier could not help but shake his head. Being responsible doesn't require you to do it, you only need to do it before. Brando replied. But I can't send my young men there to die. That would be irresponsible to them. A warrior should die with honor like a warrior. It's fine. Brando replied, I'll go. There was dead silence. What? Say that again? Martin was dumbfounded. I'll go. Why? The responsibility of the Butchie garrison has nothing to do with you. Young man, if you want to be brave, you might as well join us. The old soldier could not help but ask. No, I'm not trying to be brave. Brando turned to look at Roman and smiled. I have a reason why I must go. As for the other reasons, they are just incidental. So, little Roman, are you willing to go with me? Brando? Roman was stunned. He raised his head and his face was full of surprise. P.S. Thank you for your support. Amber's collection is not enough. If you think it's good, please help to promote it. Thank you. V-. That's all for today. I have to go home at noon. Chapter 33. The decision to split into 3 was quickly approved, and the only thing left was to move out. Martin personally led the guards to attack Madara's undead army, while Breton took the opportunity to lead the remaining villagers of Butchie to cross the River of Daggers. At the same time, Brando and the Roman crossed the Vizier Mountain path to Fortress Reeden. The time was 3 hours later. When the announcement was made, most of the young guards silently turned around and left. They didn't say much, and only the clanking of their equipment could be heard as they walked away. The campfire crackled as it burned, and the light from the fire cast a messy shadow on the beach that was covered with fallen leaves and pebbles. Other than the attack at dawn, everyone had to prepare for a lot of things. The night was still long, and the last few hours were more like torture for everyone. Freya had to gather the rest of the 3rd squad, while Brando asked for a backpack to store the remaining bottle of number 5 holy water. The extra bottle was already given to Johnson, and saved the young man's life in exchange for the goodwill of the Butchie villagers and the gratitude of their relatives. Even though he said so, Brando still couldn't bear to watch someone die with his own eyes. He felt that as a modern person he was constantly affected by the conflict in this war-torn world. Brando thought about it and felt relieved. It was the pursuit of beauty that motivated him to change the world. He casually stuffed 2 days' worth of food into his backpack. It was mainly dried meat and a type of cake made with flour, salt, and plant tubers. The world's productivity in the Amber Sword was relatively high, and you wouldn't see such abundant resources in the real Middle Ages. In fact, only those who truly understood this world would know that this was a world with a high level of civilization, but its development seemed to be on a different path from Earth. However, when he took out the long-necked bottle containing holy water number 5, our protagonist was stunned for a moment. He found a piece of cardboard stuck to the bottom of the bottle. It looked like it was stuck, so he easily took it off. That thing was about the size of a poker card. It was about the length of a palm and the width of a palm. On the back there was a pattern that looked like a magic array. On the front, there was an oil painting of a kneeling knight wearing armor and holding a sword up high. On the top left of the card, there was an ancient number 2 written on it, and at the bottom of the card, there were 6 yellow crystals. Brando recognized the 6 crystals on this item. Their scientific name in the game was Elemental Attribute, and the 6 yellow crystals meant that the Earth attribute was 6. But what was this? Brando was very knowledgeable, and there were very few things in the game that he did not know. However, the item in his hand gave him a difficult problem. It took him a while to remember that he might have accidentally taken it out from Gerald's tomb, but that didn't provide him with any clues. In the game he could still search for a bunch of random knowledge. But here, Brando only knew the local knowledge, basic knowledge, and military knowledge. What did you want him to search for? He couldn't help but hold up the card and ask Romaine, who was concentrating on mending her skirt with a needle and thread, "Do you recognize this thing, little Roman?" "No, don't call me that." Roman raised his eyebrows. "Eh? What is this, a tarot card?" "I know tarot cards." "Then I don't know either." Brando looked at the card and was about to say something. Suddenly he squinted his eyes. He saw Breton and a few other guards leading their horses from the shadows of the forest not far away. What are these guys trying to do? He suddenly remembered Martin's abnormal behavior when he was negotiating with him. His heart was filled with doubts. He couldn't help but put away the card and stood up to follow them. "Roman, wait for me here." "Yes, Brando." Although the guards were all outstanding youths, and their individual strength was far superior to the average person, it was a pity that their vigilance wasn't that good. The group of them walked all the way without noticing that someone was following them from afar. It must be known that Brando was a small team player, and if a few people wanted to go against a large guild, they would need to use stealth techniques. Thus, although he wasn't a master in this field, he was at least a veteran. It was quite easy for him to deceive these youths who had no experience in tracking. However, Brando himself didn't realize that he had already used his old tricks. This scene was nothing in the eyes of others, but in the eyes of Zeta, who was standing guard on the tree, it was inconceivable. He recognized the youth called Brando at a glance. Their captain had personally told them that he was just an ignorant and incompetent fellow who only had passable swordsmanship. However, the malicious swordsmanship was nothing in their eyes. The militia's number 1 swordsmen, such as Freya and Irene, could easily take on 10 people. They just didn't want to make a move. Since they had joined the guards, they naturally had their own pride. Take Breton for example. No matter how much he tried to bully Brando, he would never ask for a duel to teach him a lesson. That was because in their eyes, that would be lowering their status. But now Zeta saw a completely different matter. He remembered that during his scouting course, there was a scout from the Mountain Corps who imparted some combat experience to them. That scout was a knight who had received the Crimson Medal once, but compared to the youth in front of him, his skills were nothing. Brando was like a shadow in the darkness. Every time he moved, he would follow the direction of the fire in the nearby valley. If not for the fact that he happened to be in between the light source and Zeta, Zeta would have thought that he wouldn't even have the chance to discover him. Could it be that Vice Captain Breton's understanding of him was wrong? Was he actually a scout from the regular corps? Or was he a spy from Madara? Zeta suddenly felt nervous. What should he do? First of all, he couldn't make a sound or else Vice Captain's plan would be ruined. This place was less than 30 meters away from the camp, and any movement would attract the attention of other people. He couldn't help but take a deep breath, and made a hand gesture to Ryan, who was on another tree not far away, indicating him to pay attention to Brando's direction. At first, Ryan was puzzled. Why did this guy keep pointing to a place where there was no one? Did he drink too much? But he immediately saw Brando in that direction and his expression changed. Damn, is this a chameleon? What do we do? He immediately asked. I'll go first, you cover me from the right. Zeta replied. Are you sure? Yes, the opponent's swordsmanship is very good, He's at the middle level of the unranked. The middle level of the unranked was a swordsman's specialization, and was roughly equivalent to the best of the guards. Above that was the white level swordsman, which was roughly equivalent to a level 5 to 20 player. Zeta was afraid that the opponent was still hiding his strength, so he deliberately raised Breton's estimation. Ryan nodded, indicating that he understood. Brando was also in a state of shock. More than 20 people, more than 10 warhorses. Breton, are you trying to rebel? But he knew that it was impossible and unnecessary. After following for a while, he heard the people in front whispering to each other. Just as he was about to move closer, he suddenly felt a sense of danger. It was too quiet, and he didn't hear the sound of the insects from the beginning. Brando was very experienced. Although in this kind of operation the scouting and searching was usually done by the team's nightingale, he still remembered the nightingale who worked with him the longest. She was a girl called Shadow, but it was a pity that she didn't play with him anymore. However, after fighting so many battles, he had developed an instinctive acuity. Even the slightest movement of grass in the wind would alert him. Just like that day in the old mansion in Bucci when he predicted Rothko's scouting. Brando immediately felt a hand trying to wrap around his neck from behind. This was a scout's technique. Brando leaned back, one hand holding the opponent's elbow, and the other hand pressing down on the opponent's wrist. He slid down and raised both his hands. Then he suddenly pushed forward. A black figure flew out and hit the tree in front of him with a muffled groan. Their strength was about the same, but he had a slight advantage. But when he saw that the black figure didn't immediately defend himself, but instead turned around and rushed towards him, his heart tightened, and he immediately understood that there was another person. With a flash of silver, Brando's thorn of light was unsheathed. He dodged to the side, and the sword in his hand was already at the neck of the person who rushed up from behind. The faint light from the sword reflected the two people's faces. Ryan and Zeta were stunned. They thought that Brando's swordsmanship might be stronger than their vice-captain's, but it was probably limited. They had seen Breton's swordsmanship, and he was one of the best among the official members of the garrison. But just from his swordsmanship alone, it was impossible for him to fight two people at once. They couldn't help but feel as if they were in a dream. Looking at the sword in the opponent's hand, what was going on? Captain Martin is a veteran of the November War, everyone knows this. He has already served the kingdom with his life once, and has proven his loyalty. Listen to me everyone, we have an old saying, right? If Madame Martha allows someone to live, then you have to cherish this luck. We cannot let a veteran who had a narrow escape from the battlefield of glory gamble his life again. That is why I came up with this plan. Please let me lead you to fight for Bucci. This is not because I want to deprive anyone of their glory, but because I cannot escape. Well said, Vice Captain. We support you. Captain Martin will understand you. Breton smiled. When Martin ordered him to lead the villagers to break through the river of daggers, he had already decided to refuse. But he knew the old man's temper, and he would definitely not allow him to refuse. Thus he decided to take a gamble. He also understood that Martin wanted to protect him. The old captain had said more than once that he would one day stand out and become a pillar of the kingdom. But Breton also understood that Erwin did not need a coward. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but think of Brando. That ignorant and incompetent guy actually took the initiative to suggest passing through Zavale Mountain Pass. He couldn't help but maliciously speculate that Brando was just looking for an excuse to escape, because it didn't seem impossible. But at this moment, a soft sound in the quiet forest made everyone turn their heads. They saw Brando pointing his sword at Zeta and Ryan as they walked out from behind the bushes. At first, the atmosphere was silent, then everyone's face revealed an expression as if they had seen a ghost. Zeta? Ryan, what are you doing? Ah, mistake. Zeta had an awkward expression. On the other hand, Brando looked at the usually overbearing vice-captain with a face full of surprise. At this moment, the vice-captain's face was as dark as ever. How could it not be dark? If he shouted here, the vice-captain's plan would be ruined. But Brando did not expect that this guy would be so daring. He actually wanted to replace Martin and lead these youths who were willing to follow him to launch a feint attack on Madara. What kind of spirit was this? Brando felt that it was a little funny, but he couldn't help but feel some surprise and admiration. Was this the innocence and hot-bloodedness of youths, or the pursuit of their dreams? But he saw a trace of responsibility on Breton's gloomy face. It was a sense of responsibility towards this vice-captain. What are you trying to do? Breton asked in a deep voice. Of course he wanted to use a stronger tone, but he didn't want Brendel to ruin his plan. even though it seemed almost inevitable. Brando lowered his sword. P.S. Faint, when I woke up in the morning and saw that I was in 8th place, I happily went home, but when I came back after dinner, I saw that I had fallen back to 10th place. I wanted to vomit blood. Today's favorites only increased a little. I'm sad T_. Fellow students, please give me your support. Please let Amber's results reach a higher level. Also, did I offend you to post the same post 3 times? Chapter 34. Brando put down his sword. It's too dark, it's not a good idea to come out at this time. He smiled and glanced at these people. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, he walked past the 20 or so people. The young guards subconsciously opened up a path for him. Breton held his sword tightly and stared at Brando. However, he restrained himself because he knew that once he made a move, he would not be able to cover up the commotion. The people beside him wanted to rush forward, but they were stopped by him. The atmosphere in the small forest was tense. But Brando walked to the end of the forest and stopped, saying, Breton, so you learned how to disobey orders in the guards? And your plan is so lousy. You should know Captain Martin's temper. You actually want to force him to agree to your request? If it were me, I would sneak out with my men and leave only one person to inform him. Everyone was stunned. Breton's hand on the sword hilt twitched. A trace of doubt flashed in his eyes. He could not help but wonder what Brando was trying to do. Tell me, when are you going to attack? I'll decide when to move. Before dawn. The young vice-captain thought for a while. Although he was suspicious of Brando's motives, his plan did sound tempting, and it was much more feasible than their original plan. Then you better hide in the Fox Forest. That area should be the closest to Madara's undead army. Also, I'll pick up a piece of paper and pass it to Martin to let him know that you will attack before the Crimson Star disappears, right? Also, pay attention when dealing with the liches. Their spells will only work on people with weak willpower. Brando, what are you trying to do? How did you find Zeta and the others? Where did you learn your swordsmanship? Breton put down his sword and asked with a gloomy face. Well, after this farewell, I may not see you again. You may not see me again. Be it enemies or enemies, we may not see each other again. Maybe it's just a memory. After all, we are Erwin's people. Good luck. Brando waved his hand, indicating that it was not worth mentioning what he wanted to do. Breton was silent. Let's not talk about how Breton's decision made Martin fly into a rage. Freya had already gathered a small group of militia, but found that she had nowhere to go. The veteran from the November War had no choice but to let her form a group of militia, and they prepared to break out of the encirclement at the River of Daggers. At the same time, Jonathan and Petit Finus were sending off Brando and Roman. Petit Finus was ordered to leave the militia by Freya because he was too young. He was dissatisfied, but he was still young. Brando praised him a little and he was full of energy again, saying that he wanted to go to Fortress Reden. Of course he could not agree. If he did, he would probably be stabbed by Freya's sword. Although Brando needed a helper, Petit Finus was too young and not suitable. He patted the little rascal's head. Jonathan, who was at the side, did not dare to speak. He looked at Brando with shame. He knew that it was because of this young man that he was able to survive. Of course, he could not blame anyone else but himself for being too cowardly. I'm sorry, Brando, thank you for saving me. It's okay. Everyone has a moment of confusion. Jonathan, everyone is willing to bring you along because they believe that you will return to them. All right, cheer up. Don't let others look down on you. Thank you. Brando nodded and looked at the sky. The stars were fading away, indicating the arrival of dawn. But because of the lack of light from the stars and the moon, it would be the darkest moment of the world. But it did not matter because the dawn was already on the other side of the mountains. Withdrawing his gaze from the dark shadows of the mountains on the horizon, he and Roman lit the torches together. Although it was not wise to light a torch in the dark, the direction they were going was far away from Madara's territory. Even if there were occasional beasts, Brando thought that the biggest threat in the Belder Forest would be the wolves. At most, 3 to 5 of them would be easy to deal with. Besides, beasts were afraid of fire. The two followed the dense forest all the way to the south. At the end of the torch, they could see the black pine forest that was commonly seen in the Grand Region. Occasionally there would be shadows of animals, but they would disappear in a flash. They crossed 1 or 2 mountains and looked down. The terrain gradually became rugged. What was strange was that the surrounding trees seemed to have begun to wither. Jagged rocks protruded from the ground, especially at the bottom of the valley. There were rocks everywhere. Brando? Roman asked. The sudden change in the environment was a little scary. Yes, it's nothing. Follow me closely. Seeing such a scene, Brando knew that they were close to their destination. It was not that he had never been to the Zavale Mountain Road in the game. It was a very famous place and it was very dangerous for players below level 20. But Brando knew of an exception. He could not help but recall some memories of that place. The Zavale Mountain Road was in the southern part of the Belder Forest. It passed through the Pine River Valley in a lush forest. The reason for opening this mountain road was to transport wood to the lower reaches of the Pine River. But later, as Madara's power expanded, most of the timber factories withered. As a result, the Zavale Mountain Road declined and became a path for illegal merchants to smuggle goods. Later, a golden demonic tree took root here. It extracted nutrients from the ground and caused the forest to wither. It also killed any creatures that entered carelessly. Slowly, the Zavale Mountain Road became a death zone. The level 31 golden demonic tree leader had already awakened its second level of power. Its strength was on par with an iron-ranked swordsman or intermediate wizard. Even the regular army would not easily provoke such a troublesome enemy. Moreover, it did not cut off the connection between Fortress Reeden and Bucci. The kingdom's knights were too lazy to deal with it. In the game, this was a famous dungeon area. The golden demonic tree leader dominated this area for the first 3 years of the game. The NPC's way of dealing with it was to place a wooden board at the entrance. It was written in Dwarven, Elven and Cruza's common language. Danger. Those who enter this place should give up all hope. Of course, there were still some players who wanted to challenge themselves. But those who entered alone could not even see the face of the golden demonic tree. About a year after the game started, people started to form groups to explore the area. But most of them only reached the Pine River Valley before they were forced to retreat. Even in the second half of the second year, there were still news of teams being wiped out in the local bars. It became the topic of conversation after a meal. Then, it entered the Second War of the Black Rose. The number of teams that entered the Zavale Mountain Road decreased, but they became more professional. Brando remembered that he entered the valley during that era. His experience in the game was mediocre. He was neither too aggressive nor too conservative. He remembered that his team went all the way to the Pine River Valley. From there, they could even see the endless dark forest and the shadowy mountains. But the deepest memory of that adventure was not the scenery that was so different from Bucci, but the strength of the monsters in the dungeon and the frequency of encountering them. Overall, the team was almost at their limit every day. In the end, they could not hold on any longer and had to retreat. But in less than 2 months, a guild called Muda completely solved the problem in this area. That guild was famous for a time, but later people found out that they were not that strong. They were just lucky to have found a special way to fight. Later, this way of fighting was put on the internet by some people, and it even led to a craze of soloing the golden demonic tree. Back then, in order to farm a golden demonic tree's heart, Brando was one of the beneficiaries of this video. But at that time, the average level of Bucci was 27. Brando remembered that he was also level 27 when he entered the dungeon. But this time he only asked to pass through the Zavale Mountain Road, and not to kill the golden demonic tree boss. Moreover, he still had the Ring of the Wind Empress and the Thorn of Light that had a purifying effect against dark creatures. Otherwise he would have been helpless. Thinking back to that time, the price of magic equipment in the game was still high even after the first year. When he entered the Zavale Mountain Road, he did not even think about equipment with strength over 10 ounces. As for the Ring of the Wind Empress and the Thorn of Light, they were like floating clouds. But in this life, because of his foresight, he actually had these 2 items from the start. He could not help but feel that it was unreal. If he was lucky enough to escape this calamity, thinking about the future, Brando could not help but feel a little excited. But because of this, he had to cherish the opportunity in front of him. He tightened his grip on the sword in his hand, and turned around to ask the Roman to follow him. The future merchant lady seemed to have some talent for adventuring. She stretched out her hands and jumped left and right on the jagged rocks in the valley. She was actually very agile. Dawn had finally arrived and the stars had disappeared. The surroundings had sunk into darkness and deathly stillness. Only the torches were left burning, and the flickering light reflected the deep ravines and shadows on the stacked rocks. From afar they looked like 2 sparks in the forest. Brando remembered that there was a place to take shelter from the wind. It was too dangerous to enter the Zavale Mountain Road at this time. He decided that it would be safer to travel during the day. After all, this place was almost out of the range of Madara's undead army. The earliest Madara army to arrive at Fortress Reeden was the Cabius tribe, and it was on the morning of the third day. This meant that he still had a whole day to plan his plan. There was plenty of time. He looked up and vaguely saw a road sign in front of him. P.S. Today is the birthday of Decadent, the author of The Demon Hunter of Rebirth. Tomorrow is the day he will receive guests. This seems to be a good omen. Students who have monthly tickets, remember to support Decadent tomorrow. Treat it as his belated birthday present. Recommendation tickets? Of course, leave them to me. Book the tickets for tomorrow and prepare to be on the new book list. I feel like the results are a little bad. Some people have already predicted that this book will be a flop. Please support me and break this myth. Chapter 35. After entering the valley, the further in they went, the more desolate the environment became. There was almost no vegetation on the surface, and the uninhabited mountain path passed through sharp rocks. Only withered grass and brambles grew from the cracks in the rock walls. In the distant darkness, there seemed to be some withered tree branches. The cold wind in the mountains was like black smoke as it passed through the branches, making creaking sounds. Brando knew that this was because the nutrients in the soil had been absorbed by the golden demonic tree. He held the torch to illuminate the surrounding rock walls. Occasionally there would be a few white skeletons in the shadows. They looked like animals that had accidentally entered the forbidden area and became the golden demonic tree's food. The Roman held the torch and followed closely behind. She covered her bag with one hand and looked around nervously and curiously. This was the first time she had been so far away from home. It was as if the dream of a merchant was about to come true. The dangers, excitement, and the unknown wealth and treasures on the trade route had always supported merchants and adventurers to prosper on this continent. Besides, following Brando gave her a sense of security. The two flames passed through the valley one after the other. Brando placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. In the game, once they passed through this area, they would enter the territory of a type of monster, the rotten beast. The golden demonic tree was a terrifying monster. Or rather, it was a type of golden tree. Its original form was probably an elven holy tree, but after the tree herder implanted the blood of God, it awakened into a golden demonic tree. Tree herders were one of the major cults in the game. In this war-torn world, where the flames of civilization could not reach, darkness thrived. Not only did the undead exist, but there were also cults living in the soil. In the game, villains like the tree herders acted mysteriously. They left their traces everywhere like a thread that ran through the entire game. They let people know that they had a certain purpose, but no one knew what it was. Brando was no exception. The golden demonic tree had two abilities. The first was to animate plants. It could turn the shrubs on the land it controlled into monsters in human form, called rotten beasts. The rotten beasts were like the tentacles and spies of the golden demonic tree. They were everywhere in the valley. A single rotten beast was level 7 in the game. Its combat power was about the same as the garrison members that Brando had seen before, but its intelligence was low. The stronger rotten beasts were above level 13 and had awakened level 1 powers. They were also troublesome opponents for Brando. The second ability was the enchanted fruit. When the golden demonic tree's fruits fell to the ground, they would split open and give birth to a furry, barbarian-like creature. They would grow up to 2 meters tall within a day. These were the golden demonic tree's children and elite guards. Their levels ranged from level 20 to 22. Brando's only trump card against them was the Ring of the Wind Empress. After decades of accumulation, the number of demons and rotten beasts in the canyon had reached a considerable number. If not for Brando's confidence, it would have been impossible for him and the Roman to safely pass through the canyon. Of course, the golden demonic tree itself was not weak. After all, it was a tier 2 monster. However, the young man did not intend to provoke it. He knew where it was, so naturally he would not go near it. Along the way, only the rustling of their footsteps could be heard. In the silence, it was somewhat frightening. But Brendel felt a sense of familiarity. In the past, he had also brought a large number of ropes, torches, oil lamps, hooks, and rations to find the golden demonic tree. He had followed the same route thousands of times to find trouble with the golden demonic tree. The golden demonic tree would drop 20 ounces to 30-ounce strength equipment. At that time, the drops were the best. At that time, any player with a bit of skill would choose to do so. Especially the rumored heart of the golden demonic tree, which recovered 1 HP per minute. In the early days of the game, it was a godly item. But now, the only difference was that he had the future merchant lady behind him. Brando suddenly felt like he was taking a girl on an adventure in the forest with him. Wasn't the adventure of two people quite romantic? Brando? The Roman suddenly whispered. Brando turned his head and noticed that the other party's gaze was on his hand. He was slightly startled as he noticed that the thorn of light in his hand was emitting a white light from its scabbard. There were undead nearby. He was shocked but immediately reacted. Even if Madara didn't control this area, they would still send a small team to monitor it and ensure that no undead escaped. It was just a small team. Brando relaxed a little. A few low-level undead were not enough for him to deal with, but he had to be careful not to alert the rotten beasts in the canyon. He pulled out his sword and pointed the thorn of light in a direction. The light on the blade was clearly brighter, and Brando immediately knew that the small team of undead was in this direction. He gestured for the Roman to move further away, then extinguished the torch and moved step by step in that direction. There was indeed a small team of undead in the canyon, but these skeletons were currently in a bit of trouble. Leading them was the Lich Kabuka. Its performance in Buchi not only allowed the human scout to escape, but also led to the death of one of its comrades. Rothko sent it here to punish it for its disappointing performance, and also to remind it not to be too eager to appear too smart in front of its boss or master. Kabuka obviously understood, but the more important thing was how to block the attacks of the three monsters in front of it. Initially, it and its skeleton soldiers had killed a creature in the canyon that was covered in thorns and looked like a human-shaped shrub that stood up. Now its own kind seemed to have come looking for them. There were 3 of them. These monsters were shrouded in a pile of withered branches, and under their heads, there were 2 lumps of fire staring at these undead creatures. There were a few scattered skeletons around them. The battle seemed to be on the verge of breaking out. What are these roots and grass? The green flames in Kabuka's eye sockets flickered. Seeing that the other party was about to attack again, it could only brace itself and change its skeleton soldiers to strong bows. It extracted the blue soul fire to ignite the arrows, and then shot out a wave of arrows. Unexpectedly, the 2 rotten beasts that came into contact with the flames let out hissing screams and turned into 2 lumps of flames on the sand. The Lich immediately let out a cackle. This thing was stronger than its skeleton soldiers, but as long as it was a plant, it would be afraid of fire. Right? Why didn't it think of this before? What a blunder. Kabuka raised its bone staff, and with a bang half of the last rotten beast's body exploded, filling the air with wood chips. Seeing the Lich below dancing with joy, Brando, who had climbed up a protruding white rock, couldn't help but laugh. This thing really didn't know what was good for it, daring to use magic here. Magic was one of the golden demonic tree's favorite nutrients. The golden demonic tree's thirst for it was like a drug. As long as there was a trace of magic in this area, the golden demonic tree would immediately discover it, and the Lich didn't even notice. It really wanted to die. However, he was also in a bit of trouble. After all, he and the Roman were here. He had to find a way to quickly get to a higher place, or else he would be buried together with these brainless undead. He turned around and pulled the Roman up. The merchant girl saw the small group of undead below and couldn't help but blink her eyes. Her bright eyes weren't filled with fear but curiosity. "I recognize that Lich," she said softly. Shoo. It wasn't that easy to differentiate between undead. Brando only thought that the Roman was joking. Between the skeleton soldiers and the Lich, there was almost no difference in appearance other than the slight difference in soul waves. It wasn't just the low-level undead that were like this. Even the high-level undead were distinguished by their accessories or other obvious characteristics. "I really do recognize it, Brando. I saw it from afar the last time in your house," the merchant girl said solemnly. Yes. Be quiet. If we alarm them, we'll have to bear the consequences." Brando squinted his eyes. He could already see some rustling figures moving forward in the shadows. Judging from the way they moved, they should be rotten beasts. After counting to 30, he couldn't count anymore. There were too many of them and it was too dark. However, the Lich still hadn't ordered the skeleton soldiers to extinguish the soul fire on their arrows. Plants were attracted to light, so he had already concluded that the Lich was just a skeleton scattered on the ground. "There seems to be a lot of things around us, Brando," the Roman said. "Yes, come with me. Lower your body and don't alarm them." The 2 of them continued to climb higher. Brando led the way in front, while the Roman knelt on the rock and moved forward bit by bit. Now he was beginning to feel the benefits of bringing the merchant girl along. She didn't panic at all in such an environment, which was difficult for normal people to do. He remembered that in the game, when he teamed up with some female party members to enter some scary places, they would often encounter people shouting and wrangling. That wasn't the most embarrassing thing. The most embarrassing thing was that some men were like that too. As he thought about it, he quietly looked downwards. With the lich and its skeleton soldiers as the center, the rotten beasts had already gathered into a few torrents. Kabuka finally sensed that something was wrong. It subconsciously chanted the incantation for Curtain of Darkness. But halfway through, two dark red monsters charged out from the crevices of the rocks and tore its skeleton soldiers to shreds. Martha above Lord Rothko. What the hell is this? There's no need to monitor this place at all. Kabuka didn't care about its subordinates at all. There was no mercy in Madara's army. Of course, it was still allowed to protect itself, so it scuttled up the rock behind it. The lich's agility and strength weren't low, but normal people would be easily fooled by its appearance as a mage. However, Brando didn't appreciate this scene at all, because he saw the lich scuttling towards him. Damn, can't you choose a better direction? He didn't even dare to pull out the Thorn of Light. Otherwise, with a light stick in his hand in the darkness, wouldn't he immediately become a target for everyone? But he immediately saw a dark red rotten beast suddenly jump up and grab the lich's calf. It dragged it down. At this moment, the canyon was already surrounded by rotten beasts. The skeleton soldiers were probably already torn to pieces. If Kabuka hesitated for a second, it would immediately follow in its footsteps. Get rid of it. Brando couldn't help but yell in his heart. At the same time, he felt Roman grabbing his shoulder tightly from behind. She seemed to be as nervous as him. Anyone could see that if the lich got any closer, the rotten beast would discover them as well. However, the young lady's breath was like a fragrant orchid, which made Brando a little restless. He turned around and saw Romaine staring blankly in another direction. Brando subconsciously followed her gaze and suddenly sucked in a breath of cold air. Author's note: clang clang, a new week has arrived, please support me. Tomorrow is the release of Little Decadence Land of Rebirth, Demon Hunter. Legend has it that every monthly vote will give him an extra chapter? Chapter 36. Brando followed her gaze and almost threw out the Thorn of Light along with its scabbard. What kind of situation was this? Between the jagged rocks at the bottom of the canyon, there was a group of shrub-like monsters shuttling back and forth. They followed the lich Kabuka as it climbed up the rocks, looking like a black tide. On the other side, a slender figure was trying its best to climb up the jagged mountain path. She was carrying a huge bag with a sword hanging from it. Her long ponytail moved up and down with the girls leap up and down the cliff. Freya? Brando rubbed his eyes, thinking that he had seen wrongly. But even if he had seen wrongly, the Roman wouldn't. The merchant girl had a nervous expression. That was Freya. But wasn't she supposed to be following Martin to the River of Daggers? Why was she here? Brando didn't believe that she would abandon her third militia squad. It's Freya, Brando. I saw it. Don't make a fuss. I'll think of a way. Brando, Freya will be caught. We have to help her, right? The merchant girl turned around and asked eagerly. No, Roman. I don't need your help. I'll think of a way. Unfortunately, he didn't even dare to freak out. The situation was very delicate, but the key to changing the situation wasn't in his hands. It was whether or not Lady Martha was in a good mood today. But unfortunately it didn't look good. On the other side, danger was everywhere. Brando turned around and saw that the lich had unhesitatingly removed its leg bone, allowing the rotten beast that had grabbed it to slide back into the crowd of monsters. Then it flipped over and used its bony hands to support its body as it climbed up the rocks. Its 1.7-ounce strength was enough to support a skeleton that was not too heavy to climb up the jagged rocks as if it was flying. However, when Kabuka tried to climb up, it was stunned for a moment. Kabuka raised its head. The green flames in its eye sockets reflected the shocked and angry face of the young human on the rock. At first, it felt that the ripple of life was somewhat familiar, but it didn't matter to an undead, because it had already raised its bone staff and waved it at Brando. Human scum, it thought. At this time, Brando couldn't care less. He pulled out his sword, and the Thorn of Light emitted a dazzling radiance in the darkness. He stabbed it into Kabuka's skull. With a light cracking sound, a golden flame shot out from the wound on the lich's forehead, spreading in all directions. Ka! Kabuka's voice was stuck in its throat. Brando's sword was so fast that it couldn't even react before it felt its eternal life coming to an end. It had thought that it would become a great necromancer. It used all its strength to fall back, but the young man reached down and grabbed its skeletal hand. Kabuka was stunned for a moment, wondering why the other party wanted to save it. But it was an undead that would forever belong to the Dragon of Disaster. How could it accept the help of a lowly human? Just as Kabuka was in a dilemma, it saw the other party nimbly tear off the ring on its index finger. Damn it! Human scum robber. 3 experience points. This was Kabuka's last thought, and the soul fire in its eyes was extinguished. However, Brando was surprised that this lich actually had a good ring, the Ring of Cobwebs. +0. To perception. It had a familiar pattern. He also had one in the past and he didn't throw it away as a memento. Perception symbolized the ability of a character to feel that they were in a different dimension. Through hearing, smell, sight, touch, and taste, one could perfect their understanding of space and matter. This was a very important attribute in the game. At that time in Bragg's, there was a low-level dungeon called the Public Tomb. Because open flames couldn't be used in the dungeon, and the small team of players had to constantly avoid a preset high-level monster in the intricate underground tunnels, equipment with high perception and dexterity were very popular. This ring was given to him by a friend of Brando's. Thinking back, it was really bitter. In order to gather a set of 10-ounce perception equipment, he almost went bankrupt. In the end, he still couldn't clear the Public Tomb. At the mention of the Public Tomb, he suddenly remembered that there was a good item for warriors in that dungeon. It was the Badge of Courage +2 military swordsmanship. He slapped his forehead. He had almost forgotten about this. Back then he didn't want to spend any money to get this badge. Brando. The Roman's voice was full of anxiety. Brando was shocked. Miss Merchant wasn't usually so anxious. Did something happen to Freya? He hurriedly threw away the skeleton in his hand and looked back. He just happened to see a rotten beast chasing after Freya, who was running on the sharp rocks. It stretched out its withered claw and hooked the girl's backpack strap, then pulled her back. Freya, be careful. The merchant girl cried out. She stood up and lifted her skirt, wanting to run down. But Brando pulled back the girl, who didn't understand the situation. What a joke. How could he let her help him at this time? You stay here obediently. He threw the cobweb ring to the Roman and let her keep it safe. There was a limit to how many magical items a character could equip. In the witch's view, this was related to a person's magic source. But for Brando, a level 2 mercenary with a total of 40 ounces of equipment was already the limit. Okay Brando, but Brando looked around and found that he didn't feel safe leaving the careless merchant girl here. Previously, when he pulled out the Thorn of Light, its brilliance illuminated the surroundings. He had already become the target of public criticism. If he left the Roman here now, she might also attract attacks. If the little Roman was injured, then even 10,000 deaths wouldn't be enough to absolve the blame. But Freya was also in danger. He had long regarded this determined and kind-hearted girl as his most valuable companion. How could he be indifferent? This was really a dilemma. Of course, these thoughts flashed through Brando's mind in an instant. At the bottom of the valley, Freya struggled to break free from the rotten beast's claw. She struggled to run forward 2 steps but fell down again. She had already seen the 2 of them, and a glimmer of hope appeared in her panicked eyes. Brando, before she could finish her sentence, she was dragged back. Draw your sword. Brando shouted. It tangled my backpack, I can't reach it. This idiot. Brando decisively handed the Thorn of Light to the Roman. This sword can restrain them. Protect yourself. What about you, Brando? The young man shook his head and signaled her not to worry. He turned around and ran towards Freya's direction. Damn it, it's not the first time anyway. Lady Martha likes to joke with me, so I'll just let her do it. But just like in the game, monsters always prefer to find trouble with the weak. Before he could jump down 2 levels, a human-shaped shrub covered in thorns blocked his path. Young rotten beast, level 7 monster, strength 2. 2 ounces, vitality 3 ounces, agility 1. 2 ounces, dark attribute, fire weakness, slashing weakness, piercing immunity. The memories of the past flowed into his mind like water. Plant monsters had high vitality, but agility was often their weakness. Furthermore, the Thorn of Light was their natural nemesis. It was weak in fire and slashing, and the Thorn of Light was their natural nemesis. Unfortunately, he didn't have any on hand. He couldn't help but gnash his teeth and curse in his heart at the current situation. The only thing he could rely on now was his 1 ounce of agility. He did not intend to tangle with the opponent. But it seemed that the young rotten beast did not have the same thoughts as him. It made a rustling sound as it pounced towards him. Even though the rotten beast was in human form, it ran on all 4s. It looked like an uncivilized savage. Brando leaned to the side to avoid the opponent's claws. The thorns swept across his forehead and left a few bloody wounds. Luckily, it was not an undead, or else the decaying poison in his body would have worsened. But before he could rejoice, a line of green text appeared in his vision. Emergency warning, paralyzing poison invasion. Damn it. I actually forgot about this. Brando almost cursed it out loud. Because he was level 20 and could basically sneak around the rotten beast's area, he actually forgot that this thing's attacks were poisonous. Even though it was the most insignificant paralyzing poison, when combined with the decaying poison in his body, it was still unbearable. But even if he cursed, he did not dare to be careless. He pressed his hands on the opponent's thorny claws and pushed. Then he targeted the dark red rotten beast beside Freya and activated charge. It was actually an adult rotten beast. He could not help but take a deep breath. The strength of an adult rotten beast of 4.7 ounces was even higher than that of a gargoyle. Its level 1 strength was not to be trifled with. But it was a little strange. Logically speaking, if an adult rotten beast was there, Freya should have been dragged away. But no matter what, Brando used the force of the young rotten beast to fly out. He then completed a turn in midair and activated charge. His whole body suddenly sped up and crossed over the crisscrossing sharp rocks. It was like a black shadow that constantly connected on the rocks. The distance of tens of meters was covered in an instant. Let go of the backpack, Freya. But Freya desperately held onto the backpack and shook her head. She held onto a protruding rock with one hand and was almost unable to hold on. But Brando finally arrived first. Lower your head. He growled and pulled out the long sword on Freya's back. Then he cut off the strap of the backpack that the adult rotten beast was holding onto. The dark red humanoid shrub immediately lost its center of gravity and fell backward. It tried to grab onto something to stabilize its balance, but Brando had already kicked it in the chest, causing it to roll into a deep crevice behind. The rotten beast was very light and would not die from the fall, but it would not be able to find a way back up in a short time. Seeing this scene, our protagonist heaved a sigh of relief. But when he turned around, his tone became abnormally stern. Do you want to die? Freya looked up at him with her bright eyes. She probably did not expect him to be so angry. She pursed her lips and stubbornly turned her head away. But Brando suddenly saw that her hands were scraped and covered in blood. He was stunned for a moment and did not have the heart to scold her anymore. Besides, the crisis was not over yet. He sighed and pulled her up. I have a lot of things to ask you, but let's talk about it later. The Roman is still waiting for us up there. Okay. Unfortunately, when Brando was about to turn around, he saw 2 golden lights flash into his chest. 2 EXP. He raised his head in shock. He saw Roman holding her skirt in one hand and the elven sword in the other. The rotten beast from before had blocked her way. She had carefully pierced its heart with her sword and turned it into ashes. The merchant lady was also shocked. She did not expect the sword in her hand to be so powerful. Why did you come down too? Brando suddenly had the urge to beat her up. But I thought about it seriously. Brando, I don't think I can protect myself. Brando was speechless for a moment. P.S. Tearfully begging to be recommended. Step by step, the front is still far away. Chapter 37. You're going to scold me, aren't you, Brando? Nope, come over quickly. Be careful. Looking at the Roman's carefree expression, Brando could not help but feel annoyed and amused at the same time. But when he looked up, there were already 3 young rotten beasts on the rock that he and the Roman occupied. He looked around again and the bush monsters had already surrounded them from all directions. After the undead army was wiped out, they became the only target in the canyon, especially the future merchant girl who was holding the glowing thorn of light. The magical weapon was like a candle in the dark, attracting the golden tree's servants. And it was indeed a candle in the dark. Brando could almost hear the golden demonic tree's thirst for magic screaming in his heart, but he did not dare to think about it. Time was of the essence, and they might encounter more demonic trees, so they had to leave this place before that happened. He turned back and asked Freya, "How is it, can you still hold on?" Freya nodded. "Then we'll go up from the other side. Take your sword and be careful," he said as he returned the girl's sword to her. Even though the rotten beasts had already occupied the high ground, there was not a single bush monster in the opposite direction. In fact, the speed of these animated plants was not fast, and their speed of climbing on the intersecting rocks was about the same as a normal person. But they had the advantage of numbers and familiarity with the terrain. They also had high vitality, and the corresponding endurance and toughness were outstanding. Brando knew that he had to think of a way to stop these monsters. He could not help but look up at the higher ground. Freya placed her bloodied hand on the rock wall and shrank back in pain. But she gritted her teeth, tore a piece of cloth from her sleeve and wrapped it around her hand, then grabbed the sharp rock and climbed up. Brando saw this scene from behind and could not help but sigh in his heart. But he did not have much time. He took the thorn of light from the Roman and protected her as they climbed up. When he turned back, there were already 2 young rotten beasts climbing up from below. Brando, come up quickly. The Roman's voice rang out. Freya's face was pale from nervousness, and she immediately laid down on the rock and extended her hand to him. But Brando did not have the mind to respond. The 2 bush monsters did not have much intelligence, and they were already half standing up and hissing threateningly at the youth. In a sense, rotten beasts were not considered intelligent life forms, and were merely puppets of the golden demonic tree. Brando's is the swords and his sword. But when he wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to grab the future goddess of war's hand, they growled and pounced towards him. To die. Brando was enraged. He used his 1-ounce agility to push himself off the rock wall and flew over the back of the 2 monsters' heads. When his feet landed on the ground, his upper body was already in a standard attack stance. A horizontal slash. Freya let out an ah as she realized how far she was from Brando. Her talent was not outstanding, but her greatest pride was that she was more hardworking and focused on something than the average person. She was the best swordsman in Butchie's militia, but it did not mean that she was talented in swordsmanship, because most people did not notice the sweat and tears that Freya had put in. This was also why Martin admired her and made her the leader of the militia. But her swordsmanship foundation was only solid, but Brando's was more like 1,000 hammer blows. If she had to use a word to describe it, it would be clean and tidy. With 1 slash, a head fell without a single mistake. The rotten beast that lost its head emitted a ring of silver flames from its wound, and then it immediately turned into a ball of fire and fell to the ground. The other rotten beast let out a mournful cry and swung its claws. In fact, the rotten beast's claws were much longer than the average person could see, but they rarely showed this before they attacked. Many people hated it because of this, but it could not fool Brando. What a joke, he had already been tricked once in the game, how could he fall into the same trap again? Thus he was already prepared for this. At this moment he raised his sword to block, and the rotten beast's claws hit the thorn of light, creating a ball of silver sparks. The rotten beast screamed and retreated, but even though Brando was suspicious, how could he let go of such a good opportunity to attack? He shot forward like an arrow, the elven sword in his hand already drawing a striking silver line. In fact, he had done this kind of attack thousands of times in the game, so he was very familiar with it. But his attributes and skills were far from being able to keep up, which made him feel very awkward. Especially the timing of his attack, it was worlds apart. He thought that if it was an iron swordsman, it could easily dodge his attack, but the rotten beast's infant did not have that ability. The sword pierced through the rotten beast's throat. Boiling silver flames rose from both sides of the leaf-shaped sword, and in the blink of an eye, the rotten beast was turned into a pile of ashes. 6 golden balls of light danced in the night sky, and then merged into Brando's chest. To be honest, the purification effect on the undead and dark creatures was beyond Brando's imagination, but he had never seen anything similar in the game, so there was no way to compare it. Brando, you are so powerful. Roman was stunned. Freya was even more stunned, and she was speechless. She originally believed that Brando was Bragg's militia. But now that she thought about it, this young man must have been lying to her. She was not stupid. How could a militia be so powerful? But in fact, she and Roman swordsmanship had not been initiated, so they did not understand that the true standard of a swordsman was judged by the balance of speed, strength, and skill. In fact, Brando's speed and strength were still far from being a swordsman. But in terms of skill, because of his past experience, he could use many skills that low-level swordsmen would not even think of. But this was actually meaningless because many skills did not have the corresponding level of strength to support them, and were actually just a frame. For example, he took advantage of the rotten beast's low agility when he leaped into the air. If he was facing other people, he would definitely not use this move casually. What a joke, before elemental activation, wouldn't he be a target in the air? But Brando was not in the mood to enjoy the surprise of the 2 beauties. He had already noticed that more rotten beasts were climbing up. He hurriedly gestured to Freya and Roman to continue climbing, and he subconsciously glanced at the 2 piles of ashes of the rotten beasts. It was like an instinctive glance in the game, and it was funny, he just wanted to see if there was any equipment dropped. But of course there was no equipment. It seemed that there were some differences between the game and the rotten beast. Didn't they drop 1 to 2 copper coins? He could not help but shake his head, turned around and grabbed the rock wall to climb up. The agility of a rotten beast's larva was 1.2 ounces. Although the adult rotten beast's strength and vitality were far superior to monsters of the same level, its agility was even lower, only 2/3 of that of a larva. Brando had 2.1 ounce, and Freya, as a trained militia, would not be lower than 1.2 ounces. Among the three of them, only Roman was slightly worse, but with Brando and Freya's help, their speed was not much slower. Thus, the three of them climbed up the sharp rocks and gradually pulled away from the bush monsters. But the latter's endurance was invincible, and they persevered, one chasing and one escaping for a few minutes. At this moment, the advantage of the physique came into play. Other than Brendel, who was able to maintain his composure, Freya was already panting slightly. As for Roman, her small face was already as white as paper, but when Brando said that he wanted to carry her, she would not let him. Brando could not help but look back. The monsters were about a few dozen meters behind them. Fortunately, their intelligence was not enough to support them in front, or else they would have been done for. But even so, they could not continue like this, and it was only a matter of time before they were caught up. The rotten beast larva's 3-ounce constitution was higher than Brando's. He could not help but look up at the cliff in the distance. Fortunately, it was not far away. But at this time, Roman was out of breath as she shouted, "Brando, look over there." Our protagonist subconsciously turned his head and squinted his eyes. He saw a giant rotten beast about the height of 3 people, and it walked as if it was flying, coming out from a crack in the rocks and appearing in front of them. What the hell? This was an elite, it was the patrol leader. If he encountered such a thing in the game, Brando would probably be happy for half a day, but now he only had the urge to curse. This thing was a mutated version of the rotten beast that had shared the blood of the golden tree. Not only was its vitality and strength outstanding, but its agility of 1.7 ounces was also not inferior. Freya, Roman, go to the cliff. There are hooks in the backpack. As long as we find a way to climb up, these low-level magic servants will not be able to catch up. He decisively took off his backpack and threw it to Roman. He was the only man here, so of course he had to take the responsibility of bringing up the rear. In the game, although male and female players were equal as a basic network etiquette, most of the time the male character would take the initiative to bring up the rear. Therefore Brando made a decision without thinking. "I'll go with you," Freya said. Brando glanced at her and saw the seriousness on this future goddess of war's face. He knew that he could not persuade her, so he could only nod. However, this was also because he really needed a helper. At least Freya could fulfill this role well, and not the Roman who slacked off in the militia training and was determined to be a merchant. "Roman, go quickly. We're counting on you now." "Yes, Brando." Romaine obviously understood. She hugged Brando's backpack and nodded desperately, then turned and ran in that direction. The elite rotten beast arrived in front of them in a few leaps, and the horde of rotten beasts was still about 40 meters away. Brando and Freya looked at each other and estimated that they had about 30 seconds to end this battle. This thing's claws are 3 meters long. Pay attention to its attack range. Let's stand apart. Also, it will shoot out the thorns on its body. The thorns are poisonous, so make sure to avoid the front. Freya nervously clenched her sword and took a deep breath. Although she did not know how Brando knew this, she knew that he would not lie to her. However, he also knew that the other party wouldn't lie to him, so he tried his best to keep calm and nodded. Brando clenched his fists and felt a little stiff. The numbing poison from before had begun to take effect. He opened the interface and saw that his dexterity had dropped by 0.1 ounce. However, he could not help but look at the elite rotten beast and sigh. In the game, the elite rotten beast would only drop money as the patrol leader. 10 silver coins. Would it not be that there were no benefits here? Thinking about it, it did not seem impossible. P.S. So few favorites, please add. So few recommendations, please recommend. So few clicks, please click. All kinds of data are so little, please roll and beg. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.